Hello, Jackson. I didn't feel anything at all, nothing at all. I thought it would be like everyone says. But time will stop, or I'd suddenly experience something that would tell me tragedy had struck. But no, nothing. I spent all day at work as they called an ambulance and tried to resuscitate him. I drank tea and a sandwich, and as they wheeled him into the hospital, I was getting ready for work. The radio was playing. He was dying. I was listening to music. Jackson shook his head and lowered his arms. They sat at a large table in the living room. Jackson's fiancée, Ashley, was a beautiful, tall, brown girl with naturally luminous hair that fell in small curls over her shoulders. Ashley was the kind of girl who couldn't sympathize. But in a situation like this, even she knew she had to be supportive. "I'm sorry," she said, but Ashley said the comforting words coldly and blankly. Jackson only sighed in response. She'd never supported him, as if she'd kept to herself, as if she didn't care. She was, in fact, his fiancée. I got the call at 11:34. He died on the way to the hospital. They tried to resuscitate him, but no luck. It was his heart. They said it happens at his age with his illnesses. Dad never took care of his health, never even got a fluoroscopy, he told Ashley, studying her manicure. For a second, Jackson wanted to scream. She's just sitting there looking at her nails. His father had died, not a stranger. He was supposed to be her father-in-law in 3 months. But why is she so indifferent? "Tomorrow," Jackson replied calmly. "You can't demand of a man what is not in him." Well, I guess she is. The funeral took place on an ordinary rainy Tuesday. The autopsy was done quickly as Jackson had requested. He couldn't bear to put it off. He just wanted it to be over quickly. It was incredibly hard on him. The weather had been crying all day. April's icy wind with rain made everyone present shiver. "He's about to wave to us and everyone will get soaked," Jackson said, while saying goodbye to Yvonne's father, John Smith. "He's not cold anymore," he added. Jackson wanted to hug his father, but he knew he didn't need to. The horror of what was happening was tearing him up inside. At that moment, the lid of the coffin, the sound of the hammers, blessings, the plunge into the pit, and the handful of earth. No sound in the world was as terrifying as the sound of earth falling on the coffin lid of a loved one. Everyone was crying. Ashley was the only one standing there with a sad face, lips pressed. Jackson even thought she'd been looking at her nails again for a moment. She was there, accepting condolences, keeping her cool, but she wasn't crying. It was as if what had happened hadn't affected her in any way. She picked out the casket with the same indifferent expression on her face as she would pick out a yogurt at the store. After the funeral, Jackson locked himself in his father's study and didn't leave for almost 24 hours. Without him, the room felt empty, like she was dead too. How many times had they sat in that very office talking, discussing company business? At what point had their last conversation taken place? And what was the last thing he had said to his father? Jackson couldn't remember it now. A few days later, a lawyer came to see him. A tall, statuesque brunette entered the house with him. She looked like a Hollywood actress. Jackson's stepmother was well into her 40s, but she looked 30 at most. It was genetics. Veronica was insanely beautiful, sophisticated with an even matted tan, black eyebrows. She was groomed from head to toe while baking pies and making Ivan anything he asked for. At first, when they'd first gotten together, Jackson had thought it was just another of his father's flings, of which there had been plenty. After his mom died, Jackson's dad had been alone for 10 years, unable to look at any woman. He loved his first wife very much and was faithful to her. But one day, it was like something clicked inside and he changed. One affair after another. It must have been a midlife crisis. Ivan became known as a womanizer who only wanted one thing from women. Veronica was something else entirely. When Ivan met her, he had to learn how to buy flowers and jewelry. After all, she was a gorgeous, self-sufficient woman. She had a small flower store by the field, which she had turned into a unique vintage place. People went in there to take pictures, to gawk. Ivan John Smith got there by accident. He was in a hurry to go on a date with someone else's wife. Amber was working on her own that day, filling in for a sick employee. When Ivan John Smith saw her, he forgot where he was going. They talked for over an hour. Only then did his father see that there were 1,000 missed calls on his phone from this and that woman, who never waited for a date with a local businessman. Veronica hadn't agreed to go on the date, had refused. And Ivan John Smith realized we'll have to be persistent and came to her again and again, and the other day too. It took a long time. He stopped going on dates because all his thoughts were occupied only with Veronica was then already over 40. She was a widow, and the flower store was inherited from her husband. She lived in a modest one-room apartment. Ivan John Smith proposed to her and told the world about it. Jackson then thought he'd been screwed by another money hunter and started giving advice, drawing up a prenuptial agreement so she wouldn't claim anything. Who knows, maybe she's a con artist. And my father took a serious look at Jackson. I don't want to hear that about my woman again. I'm not going to look at you like you're an adult. I'm going to take off my belt and give you a good thrashing. Jackson was surprised by this reaction. He didn't think much of the other women his father had dated, and now she cared so much. She had him pretty turned on. Jackson decided to get to know her better and started visiting. She cooked by herself. She was tired after work, but she did not give up her business and sometimes worked behind the counter. It was a pleasure for her. In addition, she knew how to remove stains, and at home she wore simple sports pants and a black t-shirt. She didn't show herself as a money hunter. When Ivan John Smith fell ill, she almost forcefully dragged him to the hospital and made him undergo a comprehensive examination. That was the first and last time he was in the clinic. Everything from his heart, pancreas to his liver and kidneys. Doctors prescribed medications that Ivan John Smith had to take literally like he was in a mental hospital. She made him take pills. She would put them in his mouth, swallow them, show her tongue, and sometimes even bounce them around for a while. She even made him stop drinking. It came out through a scandal, but she got the upper hand in that argument. Even John Smith hadn't had a drink in almost a month. Sometimes Jackson envied his father. His wife was loving, caring. He and Ashley were different. Jackson realized he wasn't in love with her. It was just the way things were. Ashley was there for him. She looked great. She knew how to present herself. She always behaved exceptionally well. She was the perfect partner, and Jackson often took her on deals. Ashley was cunning, had an understanding of human nature, and was able to gain the favor of people who considered themselves elite. Jackson himself would have dined with Aunt Mary the janitor. She always had a witty answer to any question, most often in rhyme. When Veronica and Sergei Borisovich and company entered the house, Jackson was not yet ready to hear about the inheritance. Surely his father had left the house and cars to Paul, and the company had gone to him along with all the official trappings. Gilbis accounts, the son thought, would also go to him. He needed them in case things went badly for the company. It was a safety cushion that his father had been building up for years. In fact, it was much more than he needed. He could have bought another company with the money. Jackson's father was a pedantic man and raised his son in strictness. In fact, Jackson himself was not spoiled. His father's country house was empty, and his son lived in a small one-room apartment in the center of town. Ashley didn't like it. She had hinted many times that after the wedding she would like to move into a house. But Jackson loved his little apartment. It had everything. It was conveniently located. Well, it looks like it's time to divide up what was once his father's. Now, this may seem a little surprising, but I can assure you that your father was of sound mind when he made it. The date of the last revision was November 12th of the year before last. There have been no changes since then. Personally, I was very surprised to see this document, but it's accurate. The firm's attorney and chief assistant continued. The firm and all the property has been reissued to Veronica. She is now the rightful owner. You, of course, won't inherit until 6 months from now, but you can take over the head chair now. It will be up to you, Jackson, to bring Veronica up to speed. It was like a thunderclap, a low blow. Jackson got nothing. The lawyer went on to say that Jackson's name wasn't there at all, unless his father left him his coin collection. All Jackson had left was the gift of the house in the country where he and his mother had once lived. It was their ancestral home, the first property Ivan John Smith had bought with his first $1 million. Jackson was left with only an apartment and a car he'd purchased on his own. Ashley was embarrassed. She hadn't expected this decision either, or was faking it well. Jackson stared at her, not knowing how to teach Veronica the ins and outs of the business he'd spent a lifetime learning since childhood. She just wouldn't be able to handle it. After the lawyer left, Veronica lingered. I didn't. Really, if you want, I'll draw up a deed of gift or otherwise transfer the company to you. Why would he do that? He was grooming you for his position. I don't understand. I don't need the company. I have a job I love, Jackson sighed. Maybe he really should let him draw out the gift deed. But what the hell was this nonsense? How could his father do this to him? All through his childhood, he'd assured Jackson that he wouldn't need a guitar, that he'd own a company. Jackson gave up many hobbies to be a worthy replacement for his father, and now he was out of business. Jackson say something, Veronica asked. He realized he'd been silent for too long. It's a shock. And the second one in the last few days. I don't know what to say. It's what he wanted, isn't it? Maybe we should do as he decided. Veronica shook her head. There are more letters from him. What's in yours? Haven't looked yet? They read the letters drafted over a year ago. In them, without specifying his reasons, his father had asked Jackson to understand him and become a simple manager, and Veronica to leave the flower business and take over his company. It was hard to hold back the tears, reading letters from a man who was already dead. They both smeared them on their cheeks, feeling orphaned and acutely aware of how much their father was missed. I need to think it over, Jackson said. Okay, I'll do as you say. Don't worry, I don't need anything. You're his son, the direct heir, and everything will be yours if you want it. Jackson, I'm not a con artist, and I didn't ask for anything to be rewritten to me. I don't understand why he would do such a thing. Jackson smiles. I think that's why he loved you. Before you, the only person in his life who loved him genuinely and demanded nothing was his mom. Veronica smiled sadly. Jackson, that doesn't make it any easier right now. I don't think I'll ever recover. She walked away so she wouldn't cry in front of him, realizing once again that he was having a much harder time. Once home, Jackson took a hot bath and went into the kitchen. The tables were deserted. Ashley was sitting in the hall typing something on the computer. What's for dinner? Jackson asked. I ordered rolls. They'll be here soon. You don't mind, do you? She smiled. Jackson went into the kitchen and cleaned up. Ashley walked over to him there and seeing him cross his arms over his chest. But I'm sorry, I'm not a cook. That's just the way I was born. We should think about using disposable dishes. Ancients of the will was announced today, Jackson said, and gave the details. What do you say to that? Sue her. Are you out of your mind? She's a con artist. But how can you do that? This Veronica here did a good job brainwashing your father. Jackson threw the coffee cup to the floor and Ashley shrieked. Shut up. You don't know her at all. You know what? And you'd be a fool to give your father's legacy to some... Shut up, yelled Jackson. Loud argument broke out. Jackson was too vulnerable. He couldn't let anyone criticize his father's decision. He felt he had to protect him and not let him get hurt. Ashley wasn't concerned with that at all. What right did she even have to speak ill of his stepmom to his dad? Jackson went to sleep on the couch that night. In the morning, however, Emily asked him in a cold and calm tone, what has he decided to do? Nothing. It'll be just the way Dad wanted it. It's his money, and he can do with it as he likes. And since he has decided so, I will respect his decision. You're a complete fool, she said. I'm packing my things and I'm leaving you. Finally, Jackson thought. Of course, it hit him that he was only needed when he was potentially the owner of a huge company. A new period had begun in Jackson's life. Things were changing. The old life was crumbling through his fingers, and with it people were dropping out. It became clear who was with him because of his position and who was just for fun. For example, the firm's cleaning lady was loyal to the end, and when Jackson came to quit, she talked him out of it like he was her son. You shouldn't quit. She's going to ruin this place. This place has been built on your experience and your knowledge for years, and you're leaving. But why? Your father ruined it. That's no reason to burn everything on her. You work. This is your family's business. You know everything. But where are you going to go now? Jackson shook his head dejectedly, saying it was settled. He didn't want to stay, and not so much because of his pride, because of his ego. Yes, it was hard to stay in a company where you were the boss, and now you were an ordinary employee, but it was much harder to work in a place where everything resembled a father who was no longer there. Running away from herself, however, didn't end well, as expected. Veronica had begged Jackson not to leave, but he'd been adamant. If he decided that's the way it's going to be, your father certainly wouldn't want that. It's your farm. No, I think this is exactly what he wanted. I'll start from scratch. He'll leave all his toys to you, and I'll get my own business and leave it to my kids. Not sorry, kid. It's just that I'm really mad at him. It's not your fault. I know you didn't ask him to do this, but it was his last will and I intend to honor it." Jackson walked away, got in his car, and drove out onto the road. Everything was behind him. His whole life had collapsed overnight. But before that, Ashley was waiting for him at home. She'd been his rock, albeit a shaky one. And now he had empty walls waiting for him, which were also a reminder that there was no one left around. With pain and resentment, he cried out and pressed on the gas. Jackson reached the upper threshold of speed, but he didn't exceed it. He didn't want to die. He just wanted to blow off steam. Suddenly, an expensive silver-colored foreign car came around the bend. Jackson slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The collision had happened. Only after the impact of the glass he remembered that he had not buckled up, and that one bored him sharply. The left sound came from the crash that had so begged him to do so. "You're the one who wrecked my car. Is my husband going to kill you?" Screamed Hannah in a white jacket. She was white, all whites. Curly, long hair, white clothes, shoes, purse. Only her mouth was colored red. Everything was spinning, twirling. Jackson was taken by ambulance to the hospital. "We can let you go home if you want. Concussion." "No, just a bad bruise." "And shock, of course," the nurse said. "No," Jackson shook his head. "I don't want to go home. Can I stay with you? Maybe I could get an IV and put you to sleep. I haven't been sleeping much lately." The paramedics agreed, put Jackson on an IV, and he promptly passed out. 2 months passed. Ivan John Smith was sorting out his belongings at his country house. This was where he'd spent his childhood. Pictures of his parents hung everywhere, his old childhood drawings. Now it was the only place he could live. Jackson had a brilliant education, and of course, he didn't stay unemployed for long. He was immediately taken over by the local administration. He was hired as director of one of the departments, and he dealt mainly with documentation. After the accident, Jackson received an obscenely large bill from the woman in white he'd encountered. Friends advised him to sue. They said there were people who made money professionally from such accidents. The bill was just cosmic, but at the same time, everything on the merits. It was just that the car was extremely expensive, and all the parts were worth a lot of money. "I'll pay it," Jackson replied. I don't have the strength to sue." "Now." "Yeah, it could have been a scam." "Did you even look at the cameras?" "Yeah, I was driving like a madman, my own fault. I didn't have time to slow down. If I was going at a normal speed, I could have. Besides, the report's already been filed. It was the lady who was yelling, couldn't be around to pay." Jackson had to sell the apartment. He lost his father's account firm. He could have withdrawn his own savings, but it would have taken all his savings to pay for the repairs, leaving him with nothing. His father had taught him from a young age to always have a rainy day fund. That's the point. As long as you have a penny, there's no rainy day, the late Ivan John Smith used to say. Those words echoed in my ears now. The pain had not subsided in those 2 months, but humility had come. Jackson sold the apartment to a good family, taking only the necessities. He parted with the past and returned to his country home. For a week now he had tried in vain to clean up his own mess, but it had been a struggle. Now he was expecting a woman with a bucket and mop from a local company to ring the doorbell in a minute. Jackson knew getting here from downtown would be a problem and promised to pay for the trip. It needed to be cleaned up after years of neglect. He could take care of the day-to-day mess himself. Jackson tended to the rooms, thinking about how to rearrange the place so that the house would be a reflection of him, so that it would be comfortable and cozy. At the same time, he was clear that he didn't want to change anything here. It was his family home, so everything was in its place. It could use some cosmetic repairs. Just at that moment, the doorbell rang. Jackson went to open it, knowing it was the cleaning lady. But there was a pretty young girl standing on the doorstep. "Good afternoon. Who do you want?" he asked hesitantly. She was skinny with a long braid on her shoulder, minimal makeup, neat and simple jeans and a light jacket, without a hat, a heavy bag in her hands and a backpack behind her back. Like Jackson, he's the one who ordered the cleaning. She smiled. "And you're going to clean? All by yourself?" "You can't handle it," he said. The girl was short, probably no more than 160 centimeters. She looked like a teenager. "Who were you expecting, Miss Opera? Believe me, I can handle it. But where's your mess? Show me." Jackson was surprised at the girl's tenacity. He took her into the house, showed her the rooms. "This place needs cleaning." I'd have to re-wallpaper a few places, of course. All in all, it's a few days' work. You can stay here tonight if you want. There's plenty of room." The girl folded her arms across her chest and smiled incredulously. "No, don't think so. I'm not hitting on you. It's just a long drive." "No, I didn't think anything of the sort. It's just that I have 3 kids at home." "You have 3 kids? What are you, their sister?" "No, I'm their mom. I'm 32. But I look 17, she concluded. "I wouldn't sell you liquor at the store." "Well, that settles it. Let's get started. I've got everything with me. All you need is a bucket and access to water, if any." Jackson showed her what she needed and left for his father's office. He had cleaned it himself and had been living in it for a week now. There was a small couch, a television, and his own bathroom. What more did a single man need to live in a big house alone in a small pleasure? And soon he got bored of sitting in 4 walls. He came into the living room and didn't recognize her. Well, he recognized her just the same as when he was a child with his mother. Wow. I'll ask your company to give you a medal. A regular award will be enough for me," she smiled. "What's your name?" "Sharon." Jackson picked up a rag and started to help with the cleaning. Sharon began to resent him for taking away my job. They quickly switched to you, and within an hour they were laughing like old buddies, discussing the latest news. A little later, Jackson went to the kitchen and decided to please his lovely guest with a delicious scrambled egg. However, she immediately burned out. Damn them, sin threw the culinary masterpiece into the trash can. "What smells like you decided not to clean up, but to burn the place down. This place can still be saved," Jackson laughed. "Why is she so funny? Did he want to feed you? It didn't work." Jackson nodded. "Well then, let me figure something out." Sharon took over the cooking, and then everything went smoothly. And it did, in fact, go swimmingly. She made a beautiful vegetable stew out of whatever she could find in Jackson's bachelor kitchen. "You're a good cook. You weren't kidding about the 3 kids, were you?" He still couldn't believe Thumbelina had kids already. "I wasn't kidding. Who jokes about that kind of thing? Now, the older Roxy's picking up Philip and Jason from school. My youngest is a twin. He goes to 1st grade on the 2nd shift. Said Miss here, we had to split the students into shifts. It's a small school, so we couldn't fit everyone in. So the twins stay home alone until lunchtime. I'm always worried, but I can't help it." "Wow. Why did one husband leave her for another?" Jackson raised his eyebrows and even stopped chewing in surprise. "I don't believe it. How could she be better than you? You're a marvel." Sharon was embarrassed. Jackson also realized that he'd given her an inappropriate compliment in the heat of the moment. "She's richer. Her father's involved in crime. Everyone knows him. Alec Evans is a scary man. When Jake left me, he threatened to keep me away from him with the kids. Or they'd take the kids away from him, and I told him to stay out of my family. Otherwise, I can't take care of myself." "You're a fighter?" "No, normally I can't even find a decent response to a rude conductor. But when it comes to my kids, it's like I'm a different person." "Kids are great. You're lucky your husband left you, but you're not alone. You still have a family. My girlfriend left me, and I'm alone." "You're a sweetheart." She skillfully returned the compliment. And Jackson smiled. "She left when she found out I wasn't as rich as she wanted me to be." What an idiot. What does it matter what a man has? It's what's in a man that counts. But I guess I miscalculated that too. I was looking for something in the novel that wasn't there. They talked for almost an hour. Then Sharon went back to cleaning. "It's getting late. Let me drive you home," Jackson suggested. "I have to go into town anyway." He lied so she wouldn't say no. In truth, he wanted badly to just go to bed, but he couldn't make a mother of 3 jolt on the train at 2 in the morning. After she had cleaned his 3 rooms, cooked dinner, and helped him forget all his problems and worries for a full 5 hours, they rode in the car, listening to music. She looked at the lights of the city outside the window. "You know, the last time I had a car ride like that was when I was a kid. My dad was a cab driver and he used to take me with him in the evenings. We'd drive around the city at night, racing down empty streets. It was the best time. When he pulled up to her house, he didn't even want to let her go. I'll come tomorrow, try to finish everything in a day. But if not, you'll have to put up with me for another day," Sharon said. Jackson smiled and nodded. He thought to himself that he wouldn't want her to finish cleaning so quickly. The next day, Sharon left the house, waved to the children through the window, and was surprised to find Jackson's car parked outside her house. At that moment, he looked out and waved at her. "Did you come to pick me up or didn't you?" She asked in surprise. "I didn't leave. I slept under your windows," Jackson smiled. "Get in." They drove, talking about children and the school system, and how much better and easier things used to be. At home, Sharon started cleaning, and Jackson did some paperwork. He was tormented by the thought that she would soon be out of his life forever. Somehow he wished she would stay. "You're a fool. Why are you clinging to her? You've only known her for a day. She's got kids, her own life. What do you need her for? And who told you she's better than Ashley?" He asked himself quietly, staring at his reflection in his extinguished smartphone. Jackson wondered, was he ever the same with Ashley? Simple and interesting. He'd probably gotten more sympathy and understanding from Sharon yesterday than he'd gotten from Ashley in their entire relationship. Jackson thought about her, deciding whether to ask her out to a movie, whether to get her phone number. And while he was thinking, Sharon herself walked into his office with some papers. "Jackson, you said your father signed everything over to your stepmother. I found a document that seems to say otherwise." She held out the sheets to him and Jackson began to read. His ears rumbled. Sharon had found a real will and given real letters, or rather, they were copies that his father had apparently made and put in the closet just in case. He didn't think Jackson would be living in the house anytime soon. In the letter, his father said he was proud of his son and that Jackson would own his company. He asked to take care of Veronica after he died, to call her, and if Veronica's son had difficulties, he asked for help. Jackson had heard that Veronica had an adult son but had never seen him. Veronica once said he lived out of town. The letter to Veronica was touching to the point of tears. He really loved her, trusted her, warmed the snake on his chest. It turns out she forged the will, so we can find mistakes, inaccuracies, and prove it. What a snake! She wasn't going to give me anything back. It was all rigged. This is the real will. It's the same date. He didn't change anything. It's all her or Veronica. So what are you going to do? Sharon asked. "I'm going to find her. But before I do, I want to ask for your phone number. I sat in the car like a fool for over an hour this morning. I couldn't call you." "Okay, but I think it'll be over by tonight." Jackson shook his head. "I'd like you to come to my house tomorrow as my guest. I feel good with you. I can't explain it. It just feels good, that's all." Sharon smiled. "Yeah, I feel like we've known each other a long time too. It's rare to feel that way." Jackson left her alone and left for his company's office. She was still his company. On the way, he consulted with a lawyer. "You know, I don't work there. More left right after you." Veronica brought in some management people, I gather. Didn't bother to stay there. "You say there's a real will? Did she really go for that kind of sneakiness after all?" Jackson and his father's former company lawyer talked for a long time longer, discussing what could be done. Veronica must have destroyed the original will. Of course, only she didn't know how pedantic and prudent Ivan John Smith was. Entering the office, Jackson could hardly recognize it. The people had changed. There was no one left in the old staff. Even his favorite Aunt Clava no longer greeted him, smiling happily. "What's going on here?" Jackson reached the principal's office. "Oleg Evgenievich is busy right now." "What did you want?" she asked. "Who's Oleg Evgenievich?" Jackson asked. The secretary was too pretty to be smart. Pouty breasts, lips, eyelashes so big her eyes barely opened. "Director," Jackson said in surprise. "As far as I know, the director of the company is a woman, isn't she?" The secretary shook her head. Jackson didn't wait for her permission to enter his former office and simply walked in. There was a middle-aged man sitting behind the desk. He had small, piggy eyes, glasses, and sparse bangs. "What did you want?" he asked cheekily. "Where can I find Veronica Ivanovna?" "The owner of the company," Jackson asked. "Veronica turned the business over to me. Now I'm the owner." "And on what basis?" Jackson asked. "On the basis of transferring all rights to me voluntarily." "And who are you?" "A lover, her husband." "Who are you by line?" the man asked. "A nobody. She just referred matters to me. These are our matters with her. She owed me a favor. And so we settled." Jackson turned around and walked out. It was even worse than he had anticipated. The house where Veronica used to live was gone. The flower store was closed. What had happened? Who did she owe money to? Jackson returned home, and there were more questions than Sharon had already left, leaving everything in perfect condition, and had even made him a sandwich. Well, how wonderful she is. Jackson made coffee, ate his appetizer, and called Sharon. He wanted to share with someone. He had so much going on that he couldn't keep it to himself. "Why did you leave?" "I would have driven you," he said. "I didn't want to bother you. You don't have time for me right now. By the way, what have you got there?" she asked. Jackson told her everything, and they began to think about what to do next. Sharon suggested that the first thing to do was to find Veronica and find out why she had done what she had done. Jackson was going to go to the police first, but she convinced him to do otherwise. He spent the next day looking for Veronica. He went to every address she could have been at. After lunch, he asked a policeman he knew for help. Then he went to Sharon's. He didn't know if she'd be happy to see him, but he wanted to talk to her. "Come in." Her grown daughter Roxy opened the door. She was already as tall as her mom, just as pretty, with brown eyes. Then Jackson met the twins. He never learned to tell them apart until the end of the evening, and they kept asking him if he realized which one was which. Finally, Jackson took out of his jacket pocket the pen he always carried with him and marked one of them, his namesake, Jackson. It was getting late. He should have gone home, but Jackson didn't want to. He wanted to stay, but it was inappropriate to ask to spend the night. The search for Veronica had been successful only after the police had gotten involved. Jackson had been given the address of a house far out of town in a small village. He drove there and was stunned. The house was dilapidated. The fence was dilapidated. Easier to burn the whole thing down than rebuild it. Does Veronica really live here? It can't be. There must be some mistake, Jackson thought. He knocked on the window, and soon Veronica came out onto the wooden porch. She looked the same as before, in simple clothes, no makeup. "Jackson, what are you doing here?" she asked. They looked at each other in disbelief and apprehension. He held out to her the document Sharon had found. Veronica squinted her eyes at it and quickly realized what she was holding in her hands. "Come on in. I'll explain everything," she said, and escorted him through the low doorway into the kitchen. Jackson sat down at the table. Veronica poured him some tea. "It's all about my son. I had him at 16. The labor was hard. I couldn't have any more children after that, but I adored him. You know, Jake's father was a gangster. He was into stealing, robbery. I knew all that. I was drawn to him. He could stick up for me, but he was respected and feared, even by killers. And I was like a stone wall behind him. But his lifestyle got him into a lot of trouble, including trouble with the law. I asked him to stop it, and he said if I chose him, I had to accept his lifestyle, accept it or leave. So I left. It wasn't until later that I found out I was pregnant. Soon he was locked up and I was alone with a belly. The parents helped, supported me. I adored my son, but Jake had always been a copy of his father. Since kindergarten, he'd held everyone in his fist. He was feared at school. He was the boss. They took him to the police station in 6th grade. I was so afraid for him. I could see he was following in his father's footsteps, but I couldn't do anything. Jake was like that. He did his time when he was 19. Then he'd get out, and then he'd go back to prison after a while. I just didn't know what to do with him. The last time he went to jail, he told me he'd fallen in with a bad crowd. The prison had its own mafia, a criminal mastermind who was being protected by serious people. They did that to a lot of people and got to us. Jackson looked at Veronica in surprise. What were they doing? They found out I was married to Ivan John Smith and started demanding money. I sold the flower store a month before he died. He didn't know. I was afraid to tell him. They threatened to kill him if he interfered through his powerful friends. They also threatened to kill my son. When the money ran out, they beat Jake and he died. I was afraid they killed him, but they had nothing to do with it. Jackson was supposed to come out soon. And they told me if I didn't do as they said, my son wouldn't come out. He just wouldn't live. They brought me the paperwork themselves, signed it themselves. I just showed them the original will and the letter. I'm sorry, Jackson. They switched everything, but they didn't give me my son back. He's missing. They won't let me see him. I sold everything I own. I finished remortgaging my apartment yesterday. I hope they'll be paid back soon. I gave away everything I had and everything Ivan John Smith had. But that's my boy, my only son. I'd give my life for him. Please don't judge me harshly. I loved your father, I really did. And I wouldn't take a penny from him just for me. You know that, don't you? I didn't need them. Jackson shook his head. You should have gotten help, but who's to say you'll get your son back alive? It's the mafia. I was once in love with one. That's my punishment. People like Philip's father are holding him hostage, and they talked for a long time. Jackson wasn't angry anymore. He realized Veronica was just in a bad situation. They took the real will. Yeah, but I won it. When they made a copy, I put the originals in a bag and took them away. They never asked about them again. Well, they forgot, but I'm not giving them to you until I see my son alive. Okay. When is he supposed to be released tomorrow? Just don't go to the police. Please don't worry. Jackson stayed at Veronica's. They finally talked as a family. They stayed up most of the night drinking tea, and in the morning they dozed off. A sound woke them up. As they pulled up to the house, a car brought Philip. Veronica ran out of the house. Jackson stayed inside. From the window, he saw two men carrying a third man on a stretcher. They carried him into the house. What's wrong with him? Veronica sobbed. His legs are gone. They were broken at the lumber camp. It happens. It can be repaired. Just don't go to the police. Watch out, or we might come back, one of the bandits said as they drove away. Jackson came out of the other room. I got them on my phone, and I got their threats too. We'll prove everything. But it looks like your son needs to be cured first. Veronica was crying. Philip did too. He could talk, he could understand, but he was very weak. He hadn't been fed or bathed. He was wearing diapers. He must have been kept in some kind of infirmary or something. Jackson called an ambulance. Philip was taken to the hospital after getting the doctor's report. Veronica and Jackson exhaled. Surgery was possible, the doctors said. Philip said he fell down the stairs and was home alone for a long time. He didn't say anything to his mother. It was only when he and Jackson were alone that Philip admitted that he'd been beaten deliberately to intimidate him more. They'd gotten a lot from Veronica. A fortune in the firm. They needed a safety net. They wanted to kill me, but I didn't die. They said to let him live if he wasn't dead. I'm afraid they'll come back and kill me and my mom. We're a threat to them now that we're alive. And they'll need one more of her signatures when the deed to the apartment comes. And then that's it. I think they'll just bury us afterward. Jackson realized he had to act fast. His acquaintance on the police force, having heard the story, approached the colonel, who was an old family friend. After hearing what was going on in his town, the big boss ordered a special operation. Jackson handed them the videotape he'd made at Veronica's house and his father's real will. Afterward, she was terrified. It was scary that the bandits would find out about everything and kill them. But Philip was admitted to the hospital. Neither Paul nor Jackson could not afford a private clinic, so the son was in an ordinary one. There, in the same room with him, changed into a robe and slippers, lay an undercover policeman with a gun on his belt to protect him in case of emergency. And Sharon agreed to participate. Veronica said that all these companies Charles Edward kept a lot of important papers. There were Veronica's receipts that he made her write. There were videotapes Charles had shown Veronica that showed Philip being beaten and threatened to kill her if she didn't give them everything. Sharon was supposed to get a job at the company as a cleaner and retrieve the tapes. Jackson had a spare key to the safe. So it was just a matter of getting in there and taking it. After that, the criminals could be caught red-handed. Sharon called and was invited to an interview. Luckily, they were looking for an employee. The salary offered was small, but Sharon agreed to everything. The most unpleasant part, however, was meeting her ex-husband there. He had contacted the daughter of Charles Edward. He was the criminal mastermind who made me clean up like old times, Sharon grinned. I need the work. I'm actually raising 3 kids by myself, Sharon said, realizing she couldn't blow the operation. Now she was even more anxious to get them all arrested. Turns out her ex-husband was involved in this whole nightmare. And how many people, she wondered, had they so intimidated, beaten, and robbed? After getting through the humiliation, Sharon got to work. The first day, she didn't venture into the office. Her ex-husband watched her and kept trying to humiliate her. On the second day, he was called somewhere. Charles left too. Sharon was left alone in the office, inserted the key, took all the documents out of the safe and stuck them in the wastebasket. She left the camera there, only taking the memory out of it. Then she put the papers in the bag and quietly walked out of the building. But instead of the trash can, she turned the corner. It felt like she was being followed. At the corner, Jackson was waiting for her. Sharon almost ran. It was scary. I did fine, he said, kissed Sharon. We're going to get these rascals red-handed. I think I've been watched. They won't be able to find me. Tomorrow morning, Veronica puts the signatures at the MFC where the deal is processed. And that's it. That's where he'll be arrested. He won't turn away, won't say he didn't sign anything. And there are cameras everywhere. Call the office and tell them you found another job so they won't be looking for you. Anyway, sleep at my place tonight with the kids. He won't be looking for you there for sure. He picked them up and took them back to his place the same day. Now it was necessary to lure Charles out and get him at the scene of the crime. That would give a better chance of putting all the criminals away for a long time. It's going to be okay. You sign wherever you need to and step aside, and I'll call you. The head of the special operation instructed Veronica. The document was to be signed by Charles Edward Gollivan himself. I understand, but if anything happens to me, please take care, Veronica said. She went into the MFC building, signed the document. Charles was there as well. Veronica stepped aside, talking on the phone. At that moment, the police grabbed the perpetrator. The accomplices and the people who helped them commit lawlessness in prison were found and captured. We have arrested them all. Now they are silent, hoping for lawyers. But they were taken too when it was all over. Jackson returned to his house and realized he hadn't called Sharon in ages. He dialed her, but she didn't answer. Was she hurt? Sounds like it. Jackson got in his car and drove to her house. Rang the doorbell. She opened it. IAA. But you're not answering your phone. Just thought you didn't want to communicate since you haven't called all these days. I called it myself. You hung up? Well, so I figured. Jackson shook his head. Oh, women. I'll tell you all about it now, and you'll realize why you were wrong. Jackson's tale took a good deal of time. Sharon listened to him with her mouth open. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was like this. I thought you were just ignoring it. I mean, you said you wanted to communicate. You picked up the phone and disappeared. Is that what's going on here? It's just that usually a person doesn't call. There's only one reason. They don't want to. Isn't that right? Jackson smiled. Not always. They talked for a long time. On the way to her place, Jackson stopped by the store and bought the kids a bunch of candy. What's going to happen to Jake now? He doesn't walk. He's lucky to be alive at all. They did things to him like that. As soon as I get my father's company back, I'll pay for his surgery. At the best clinics overseas. Then Sharon asked. No, we have excellent doctors, I've already found out. It's only a matter of time. I've already sent them inquiries and prepayments. I had some money left over when I sold the apartment. So, the treatment will start soon. He'll be prepped for surgery for a few weeks to get his labs back to normal. And these people, Charles Edward, they're no longer dangerous. Probably not, but there's no guarantee. Who knows what connections they have left? Maybe they'll want revenge. No, a judge, Sharon sighs. I wouldn't want anything to happen to you. Jackson smiled. How nice it was to hear that she cared about him. Did I clean your house for nothing? Jackson began to visit them every day. The children had gotten used to him. The eldest was wary of him, but he managed to gain her trust. Sharon had grown accustomed to Jackson and trusted him completely. They were very good together, as if they had been made for each other. Litigation began to take the companies out of the hands of the crooks. Philip testified, which was taken into account in court. Veronica testified too. There were others who testified. Veronica wasn't the only one who signed over her assets to Charles Edward. The newspapers were full of headlines about the uncovering of a major crime ring. The case had gotten a lot of publicity. Philip, on the other hand, was being prepped for an operation in the capital. You have to give blood. It's a precautionary measure, the doctor said. I'm his only relative, Veronica informed him, and she was led into the office. She was with Philip in Moscow, while Jackson and Sharon stayed in their home. Their little town was only a few hours from Moscow. So when Veronica called Jackson, he quickly packed up and hit the road with Sharon. Are we sure we'll be back before tonight? She asked. I promise. Just need to give blood. I don't know if mine will fit. So if you donate too. But if yours fits, he has some rare type. Surgery is coming up and I have a rare one too, Sharon informed. But actually it's usually relatives who pass. Veronica donated, but her blood didn't match. Isn't she his mom? Sharon wondered. Yeah, the doctors checked. They have different DNA. I don't know where they messed up. Veronica's in a terrible mess right now, doesn't know what to think. But the bands are so different, she just couldn't be his mother. Arriving at the clinic, Jackson found Veronica crying. Well, How can that be? His blood type is so different. You just can't find it. And they say I'm not the mother. Like Jackson hugged her. The doctor came over to them and explained everything again, what the blood was for, what kind of blood was needed, and what quantity. If something went wrong, they needed backup. I have that type. Sounds like you're lucky, Sharon smiled. Jackson put his arm around her. You're my treasure. Come with. Veronica and Jackson stayed in the hallway. I have to talk to the doctor. But where is my baby if Philip isn't mine? I can't believe it. I mean, he looks so much like his father, but I thought he did. Is it really just a coincidence? It just doesn't make sense. Sharon gave blood. After a while, the doctor told her that their DNA and Philip were related. Now that thought kept her on her toes. Jackson drove her home and left. There was no place to sleep. Lots of kids, small apartment. Maybe we should move them to my place, he thought. He disliked the thought more and more. Dad wouldn't approve of her. She was probably a janitor. He was a little prejudiced. Like, for example, Veronica was a store owner. He would hardly have looked at her if she had been a janitor. It's a good thing I'm without those arrogant cockroaches in my head, Jackson thought. He was perfectly happy thinking about Sharon. So small, so cute. Just a miracle. A few days passed and Philip underwent surgery. The doctors said it had been a success and he would now begin his recovery. The company belonged to Jackson again. He received the documents and immediately returned to his office. Everything here reminded him of his father, but the memories were different now. Everything that had happened lately had forced Jackson to accept the fact that his father was gone. Now he was anxious to preserve and grow the family fortune, except that the bandits had left the firm in a dismal state in a matter of months. Reports were overdue. The IRS demanded the day before yesterday. Jackson had been at work all day, but now he remembered to call Sharon, lest she decide she didn't need him again. Jackson was happy to have a place to come back to. He started sleeping over at Sharon's, got himself a couch, ordered delivery, put it in the corner of Sharon's room from Poltava. That was the official story. In reality, as soon as the kids fell asleep, he would move in with her, cuddle up to her, and fall asleep. Meanwhile, Veronica found out why her blood and her son's blood turned out to be different. After Philip's surgery, she went to the maternity hospital where she had given birth when she was very young. An old friend of hers was working there at the time. She was a little older and had interned as a midwife. Now Kathy had worked there for many years. Veronica drove there, found her, and walked into the office. Kathy saw her and sighed heavily. I knew you'd come to see me one day. Come in, she said. Do you know why I came? Veronica asked. Her friend nodded. Will you explain how so? Philip is not my son. Where's my baby? You gave birth at 16, and the labor was hard, and the doctor wasn't there that day. The nurse was drunk and got fired. I'm all alone here. It's a small ward. No referrals. They were already taking everyone downtown. At the time, we thought they'd close the hospital, but later they renovated it. You remember fainting, don't you? I thought you were going to die on me. And when I delivered your baby, it was my first labor, Veronica. I delivered it, and your baby was born dead. I was alone, and there was a mom in the next room who said she was going to write a DNR. She didn't have the courage to abort, so she decided that she would give the baby to someone who needed it more. That mommy had a 1-year-old daughter in her arms. It wasn't easy for her, you know. Veronica cried, remembering it all. And why did my baby die? Did you do something wrong, or did I? You were too young to give birth. You're skinny now, but back then you were dystrophic. The labor was hard, that's all. Your body couldn't handle it. The baby was tiny. And we had no equipment, nothing. It's nobody's fault. I gave birth dead, that's how it happened. And I took that woman's baby. I just gave it to you. She left the hospital right away. I forged the papers. No one found out then, and you were happy. Veronica, I was afraid you'd kill yourself. You wanted this baby so badly, even though you knew you'd have to raise him alone. I mean, after you broke up with his father, you just kept thinking about it. And when the doctor said you couldn't have any more children, I knew it was worth it. Don't be mad. She didn't want a baby, but you did. But who would feel bad about that? Veronica shook her head. No one. Thank you. At least now I know the truth. And thank you again, my dear. They hugged, and Veronica stayed with her friend for a long time. She wasn't angry. Katie had made a hard decision that could have ended her career as a doctor once and for all. And Veronica didn't love Philip any less. He was still her son. Besides, all these events had brought her closer to Jackson, and now she thought of him as her son too. "Tell me, what is my Philip's mother's name?" When I told him my blood wasn't a match, he asked me that. Oh, I remembered that for the rest of my life. His mother is Anna Frederica Ivano. Veronica told Jackson that name, and he called Sharon. "This is my mom, Anna Frederica Ivano." "I'll be right there," Sharon said, disbelieving her ears. The doctors weren't wrong. Her blood was a match precisely because she and Philip were related. "Hi," she said into the phone. "Do I have a sibling?" There was a pause on the other end of the phone. The mother confessed that she was expecting a child but didn't want it. It just happened. She couldn't abort it. A lot of people were wrong. Every time she tried to walk into the hospital and make an appointment. And when a nurse told her that a young girl had lost her baby but didn't know it yet, Anna herself suggested, "Give the boy away. Let her be a happy mom. You understand, we had a daughter. You were hard to raise. We couldn't handle it." Sharon said she understood, but she was still angry at her mom. She started calling Philip regularly, asking how he was doing, how his recovery was going, and when he was brought back to town, she became a regular at Veronica's house. Sharon was drawn to her brother, and Philip was glad to find his sister too. He'd always dreamed of it, but knew it wouldn't happen. Jackson, on the other hand, had officially married Sharon, and he threw a grand banquet. The company's business was booming, and after hearing the company's story, people were drawn to Jackson. The media made him look like a hero for uncovering a criminal conspiracy. With such a man, everyone wanted to cooperate. Jackson also officially adopted all of Sharon's children, and they began to get used to calling him Daddy. "I have a surprise for you," she said when she met Jackson after another day of work. "Guess what it is?" He smiled, inhaling the delicious scent. He knew immediately that Sharon had made his favorite cabbage and caviar pie. Anna walked over and showed Jackson a pregnancy test with 2 clear stripes. "Wow, is this what I'm going to be, a father?" He was shocked. Sharon nodded, and he hugged her tightly. "But tell me," she asked, not yet realizing how he would feel about it. They already had 3. "Yes, I'm insanely happy, Jake." "I'm happy," Jackson cried with joy. As a matter of fact, when he had been told he had a daughter, he had cried too. Now he was an absolutely happy father. He only regretted that Daddy hadn't lived to see this moment. He'd given him a country house, dreaming that Jackson would have a big family. And now he had one, and Jackson often remembered how he thought he should have 2 sons and 2 daughters. And now he did. A mother with many children bought a house in the countryside with her last money and decided to dismantle the stove. Annie took one more look around her parents' apartment and her miserable belongings. What had she prepared for the journey? In the kitchen, the twins, her 2 favorite sweet couples, Megan and Emily, were finishing their tea and gnawing on 1 bagel for 2. "Sweet tooths, Tommy," Christian Annie said. Another equally ruddy bagel and a bowl of apricot jam stood on the table. A car was due to pick them up in half an hour. There was still time to see if everything was packed for the long journey to her new life, which she did not know how it would turn out. The woman sat down heavily on a small stool in the hallway, sighed, tried to pull her thoughts together so she wouldn't cry. Not to win snot on her fist. She didn't like weaklings. "And here you're going to go." She wanted to sob in her voice to the bone. 30 years down the drain. Childhood, youth, father and mother, her late husband. Did it all happen within the walls of this house? The apartment was dejectedly silent. Only on the landing the old elevator farted like an owl, whether it was taking someone up or taking them down. Annie would never have sold her parents' inheritance if it hadn't been for fateful circumstances. Everything in life must be paid for, including insanely passionate love. That's fate, and billed her now at the full rate. Their home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles got Annie's parents honorably after hard work at the candy factory. The girl's father was an adjuster of production lines. It was thanks to his bright head on the conveyor belt smoothly rolled all these lush cakes, dressed with chocolate icing, beckoned sugar-colored marmalades. To the mother, sweet treasures a little later got to the packaging. The workers put the fragile products into colorful boxes marked "Made in the oldest candy factory in the USA." The soul rejoices without a premium. And if they also give a bonus, so in general, here it is, simple happiness. In stores, the goods flew off the shelves across the country, boxes of products dispersed, giving the staff of the confectionery factory and decent salaries by those standards to receive, and social benefits to enjoy. So the masters of tasty business got this 2-room apartment. They furnished it with new furniture, a sofa, a TV set, a couple of armchairs, a floor lamp, a sideboard, crystal. This is in the living room, and in the bedroom, where the 3 of us slept for a long time, until Annie finally grew up and moved into the hall, put 3 beds. We have girls like the 3 bears in a fairy tale, Dad joked. The biggest bed for Papa Bear, the smaller one for Mama Bear, and the baby for their bear cub. Annie envisioned this picture and burst into a long, happy laugh. At that time, because of her young age, she did not think about why her parents slept in separate beds. There was already an irreversible distress living in the family. But at that time, Annie had little understanding of what was going on. They were endlessly happy. It seemed to the 3 of them that it could not be otherwise. Annie's mother was not allowed to have children in the sense of giving birth on her own. But she wanted a child so badly that she took the risk. Annie was born, and Isabella herself underwent a complicated operation after the birth. They didn't leave anything inside the childbearing chamber. Daddy tolerated for a long time honest wife. Even close relations with her husband were not recommended. And then, as if off the chain, could not miss a single skirt. Hunger flew out of the secret gut, like a cork from a bottle of champagne. Christian had been a model family man before the birth of his daughter, and afterwards he made a conscientious effort not to distance himself from his wife. But the male nature was stronger than all the vows made to himself. The first affair, Christian started on the side, released the genie on the loose. Now he wanted more and more adventures, more emotions and victories. Isabella was not in the clouds. She did not press her lips when she first found traces of lipstick on the collar of her husband's shirt. Isabella didn't faint from the perpetual swarm of feminine odors now always surrounding Christian. When he returned to the home in the late afternoon, it came as no shock to her when she realized her husband had been hit on in earnest by another woman. He even stopped going to the movies in the park with Annie, her daughter. On weekends, he'd come back late at night, spending long hours furiously scrubbing his tracks in the bathroom. Then he could spend hours on the balcony smoking one cigarette after another, agonizing. Isabella knew Christian was making a choice, and she sensed it would not be in her favor. The difficult conversation took place in the midst of spring. Birds were chirping outside the window and lilacs were fragrant in the yard. The fragrance wafted insistently through the open window into the kitchen, where Christian was explaining himself to Isabella. "I've met another woman, and it's stronger than I am. I don't live, I don't breathe, I don't exist if she's not around for even a few hours. I'll pay child support. But I can't go on living in this house, away from my beloved." Christian's things are packed. While Annie was in class, Isabella realized her husband had endured 8 whole years in a cold bed. His manhood was also short. Everything was inevitable from the time when she was made an inferior woman after childbirth. Surprisingly, there were no tears and wailing. She was too tired of feeling guilty. And she also knew something about herself put her again before the choice of having a daughter or a husband. She would choose a daughter again. A couple of months later, Isabella learned that Christian and his new wife had left for a shift in Norilsk. There, their traces were quickly lost under the snowdrifts. It was only 300 kilometers to the Arctic Circle. Christian kept his promise. He transferred the money to Annie accurately and on time. By the first day of each month, Isabella and her daughter were living together. But strangely enough, it was hardly noticed that now there were only girls in the house. Annie unequivocally took her mother's side in the divorce. "Mama, I'll always be there for you," she said seriously, as if she were an adult. "Men sometimes go off to other women. It's their nature." Isabella laughed heartily, hugged her budding daughter, and replied, "Someday, my good one, you will meet your man, your soul mate, and change your ironic attitude to the male sex. We will discuss this topic many times." Isabella was right on the money. Annie went from a little girl at 15 to a total beauty. You can sit down and paint a picture of her now. Light, slender, with big blue eyes, smooth long hair the color of coal anthracite, feminine, early formed figure. Classmates pelted her with notes with invitations to the movies or disco. But the heart of the young beauty was suddenly occupied. In the next doorway of their house lived a little swagger, but very handsome guy named Robert. The kind of guy that women of all ages turn around and cast languid glances at. Robert was ironic and cocky, superbly built, with a masculine brutality in his demeanor and gaze. What eyes there were seemed not to notice beside him. At the same time, past the female sex, he somehow passed indifferently. Dates did not impose. The thresholds of the house did not dwell. He worked as a lawyer in one of the Moscow law offices, dealt mainly with civil cases. And yet there was something subtly slippery, murky about him. Isabella could not even explain to herself why her heart was so tight when she caught her now 17-year-old daughter on duty at the window. Annie didn't even immediately realize that her mother was already there, and she was also looking at Robert, strolling toward her brand new foreign car. This young man was born with a golden spoon in his mouth. Dad is a diplomat, Mom is a theater actress. His parents were public figures in Moscow. They occupied a whole floor in their house, having bought and renovated 2 adjacent apartments at once. Not housing, but chalets in a quiet green neighborhood of the capital. The woman then thought, God, but why Isabella liked him? There is something about him that makes me suspicious, but I can't understand what it is. Matthew was 10 years older than Isabella. Between them lay a deep chasm of his life experience, his high school diploma, the beginning of his career and her girlish naivete and purity as a 10th grade graduate. No miracle can happen. And that's great, thought Amelie to herself. He'll never pay attention to a girl. I mean, how many local and foreign girls have been hunting him? All of them have passed him by. He did. He stopped suddenly as Amelie and Annie were running, laden with groceries from the grocery store. He gallantly opened the door for them. He glanced at Isabella appraisingly, hummed something to himself, and the tray girl was stunned by his presence, frozen in front of the steps like a statue, while Amelie almost poked her in the back with her nose. And there's Matthew, that young man from the other Isabella, Amelie thought. Not his type. He'll break her heart. You won't know what hit you. Her daughter was embarrassed, but came to her senses quickly. I love him, Mom. I love him so much that I won't even listen to you this time. If he calls me to follow him anywhere, I'll go. I won't hesitate. These seconds are my choice. You'll have to accept that. A true daughter of her father, Amelie thought immediately. He, too, had fallen madly in love and refused to compromise. At least my inexperienced girl did not get into some unpleasant story with her unearthly love. Well, if fate has decreed so, it is only necessary to tell her that if she gets burned, the door of the house for her is always open. Amelie was pulled out of her memories of what her life with her handsome husband had been like by her daughter. Mom, we cleaned up the kitchen. When is the car coming to pick us up? You said that our new house in the countryside stands almost on the banks of the river, that around a dense forest with hares and squirrels. 86 years have already passed to my Arkarovsky, and all dream of adventures, thought Isabella with love. At least Matthew had left something light behind on this earth. What would I do? How would I live if I didn't have my magnificent foursome? Isabella stroked the curly heads of her older sons, tightened the colored rubber bands on the girls' ponytails, brushed the stockings of the girls with the little comb she always carried in all her pockets. Forward, my young princesses and knights. Great things await us, she said. The minibus she had hired was puffing away in the driveway. She looked back at the home she had lived in for 35 years and stepped boldly onto the step. Today closed a large and poignant page of her life. By evening, they would be in place in their newly purchased home 300 kilometers from Miami. Isabella had sold off all the furniture and utensils, rightly deciding that if she was starting her life from scratch, in a new place, let everything around her also be different, still unexplored. The old apartment all reminded her of the former failures and joys that had also been. And to anger God that she had not had many very happy days in her life, she would not. It would be quite unfair to fate evil. Presents in the form of bright universes of celestial life did send her. Isabella leaned back gracefully on the soft, comfortable back of the seat in the minibus, and again, indulging in memories, the twins chattered about something of their own in the back. For a while, she even forgot about the tragic events of the last 2 years and went back there, far away, to their amazing romance with Matthew. The first guy in their yard was waiting for her at the driveway the very next day, twirling his car keys on his finger and smiling his unimaginable smile. It was for her, Isabella. As she walked away from the driveway, he rushed to the back seat and pulled out a luxurious bouquet of delicate maroon roses with some beautiful pink veins. "Your name is Isabella, isn't it, neighbor girl?" He touched her hand with his fingers, and Isabella felt as if her skin was burned in that spot. "Isa. Bella," the girl answered, stammering. "And you are?" She asked this stupid question, realizing perfectly well that he knew that she knew his name. Matthew smiled his charming smile once more and suddenly proposed. "How about I show you my town? The one I'm crazy about. The one I know so well. The one that every other Miami resident sometimes never gets to visit in a lifetime." Isabella swallowed her saliva and answered guiltily. "There's no way I can do that right now. I'm going to school for a physics tutorial. We have a final exam in a week." Matthew didn't raise an eyebrow, slipped the impossibly beautiful roses into her hands and replied, "Then we'll postpone our date until after your final exams." He jumped into the front seat, deftly squeezing himself between the steering wheel and the back of the car seat. The engine rumbled softly like a contented March cat, and the car disappeared in a flash. Only Isabella remained standing in the yard, agonizingly trying to make a decision to go to the consultation directly with a gorgeous bouquet of roses and be on time, or to return home and put the bouquet in the most expensive vase of sec crystal, but be late. In an argument with myself, the third solution was chosen. Her face was burning like a fire from the surge of impressions and emotions. It was unthinkable to show up at school like this, and there was no one at home right now. Having decided that she would ask her friend about the questions and answers discussed with the teacher at school, Isabella rushed home and spent almost 2 hours alone admiring her first flowers from a man. Then there were so many more dizzying things to come. Matthew did not like to walk around the city on foot, but he drove her around Miami endless times. His behavior was impeccable. He never allowed anything but a light touch of his lips to hers after a farewell meeting. Even when Isabella was sent from the confectionery factory to a sanatorium on a discounted voucher, Matthew did not ask for a visit. So passed their chase meetings until Isabella's 18th birthday. After graduating from high school, Isabella was absorbed by the unexpectedly fell on her first love. With the choice of university, she did not particularly went to the University of Miami at the Faculty of Philology. She did not like exact sciences very much, but she loved to read books, all in a row. She thought that the profession of a teacher of literature sounds decent and cultural. And the prestige, what about prestige? She didn't want to be an astronaut, or a mall manager, or a TV hostess. She was fine with that. Matthew was a little ironic about her choice, but then he made a joke. "Why are you going to teach our children? Writing essays, speaking nicely, and social behavior are already bred, in a sense." When Isabella heard our children, she opened her eyes wide, and then for the first time she couldn't help herself and threw herself around Matthew's neck. "Do you understand what you just said? You said I would teach our children. Was that a joke? Tell me, Matthew, you were joking." The man indulgently put his arm around her and stroked her shoulders. He looked into her eyes, and then he kissed her lips with a long kiss. How long had she waited for this moment? How long had she dreamed of her first adult kiss? And yet she wasn't ready for it. The ground fell away from under her feet, the sky fell to the ground, or was it just her imagination? At that moment, Isabella realized that this man was her personal god, her lord, her master. She would follow him into fire and water. Future events were predetermined. Studying at the university, Isabella suddenly came to her liking. The group gathered soulful, as usual at the women's faculty, long heated arguments about the next classic literary masterpiece, seminars in English, where she learned the basics of literacy. Sometimes Matthew would meet her after class and they would go on exciting trips around the state. During the school year, they visited Key West, Sanibel, Mount Dora. One day they wandered around the Everglades all day and then had a picnic with sandwiches right by the lake. Matthew seemed to Isabella a sophisticated aesthete, immersing her in a world of sweet dreams. A man without flaws, a knight from the old books, pleasing his lady in every possible way. Sometimes he suddenly disappeared for a few days and came back happy, said that there was a business trip, all adrenaline. But it only gave him vigor and strength. After the first year, when Isabella's session was over, Matthew took an envelope out of the glove compartment. "Baby, I've got a surprise for you. A trip for two to Venice. You wouldn't mind keeping me company in this exquisite land of canals, would you?" While Isabella ran to get her passport photo taken, she and Matthew applied for a Schengen visa. He himself had had a multi-visa for a long time. Annie looked disapprovingly at the whole thing. "It's no use," Isabella whispered in her mother's ear. "I love him to bits. There is no such thing as so much happiness." In Italy, Isabella was immediately dumbfounded by the beauty. She held Matthew's hand like a mesmerized woman and jumped frightened when dark-skinned people tried to sell Isabella souvenirs and some handbags to passers-by. And Saint Mark Square near the Doge's palace, Matthew and Isabella spent a long time feeding an army of pigeons, having bought a whole bag of grain for €1. The robber birds tried to peck the provisions right from the palms of their hands. Loving couples clung to both of them from all sides, so some tourists immediately began to take pictures of this scene. Matthew booked a hotel near the house of the legendary Casanova. Was this the reason for the uniqueness of their first night, or was it the Venice air? The first time Isabella was with Matthew, she barely remembered the sweetness, the dreams, the fog, the thrill of falling into the abyss while holding hands. By morning, before falling into slumber, she asked, "Why have I never seen any other women around you? You're a wizard." "I was waiting for you, my enchantress," the man replied. Such an inexperienced and trembling girl to lead her down the path to paradise. Isabella remembered the next days in Venice as if in a fog. Coffee and pizza on a cozy summer playground, all on the same Piazza San Marco. Long dinners with a glass of wine. Shopping for gifts for her mother, they bought her a luxurious Venetian mask decorated with bright red and black feathers and the invariable colored stones. Isabella herself was also bought outfits and jewelry. Matthew spared neither money in boutiques nor the energy of tenderness at night in their wonderful room. In terms of procreation, the man was careful to use protection. To the mute question in Isabella's eyes, he remarked weightily, "You will teach our children Russian language and literature later. The main thing now is to get your diploma." Isabella changed her position on the seat in the minibus. There were no more than 50 kilometers to the final destination. The children were peacefully dozing in the back. She could go on rehashing the pages of her sweet life with Matthew, but she remembered something else. The shock she'd experienced when she'd learned that her now husband was a gambler. At Matthew's parents' wedding, in the midst of the raucous party, it seemed to Isabella that everyone kept looking at her strangely. The essence of these looks she realized later, after a frank conversation with her mother-in-law. "You don't know yourself, child, what kind of story our Matthew has gotten into with this unearthly love of yours. He's sick. A mad gambler. Like every gambler, he's had his downs and ups. Big winnings alternated with temporary cash fiascos. In parallel, he began studying at the Law Academy, which, contrary to his passion, graduated with a red diploma. Neither the heat of his addiction cooled down, nor did the career that began later, quite successful for a young specialist." Annie breathed a sigh of relief. "And only after he met you. They could not believe their eyes you were able to conquer the heart of our impregnable fortress in male form. In 1929, when all such establishments were noisily shut down, Matthew seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. And then he began to go on imaginary business trips to those unfortunate zones in Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and Monaco. He flew there infrequently, came back inspired, but he was increasingly unlucky. One day, my husband Christian discovered that expensive things were disappearing from the house. I was missing some diamond and emerald jewelry from my jewelry box. Christian's conversation with Matthew was stern. His father gave him an ultimatum: either he ends his gambling dalliances or moves out of the house. That's when Matthew announced to us that he was getting married immediately and would live with his wife. Isabella could not believe her ears. All this story, told by the new mother-in-law, could not be true. There was no way her idol, her husband, her Matthew, could be a gambler. They've been together for years. Except for the occasional business trips, from which he returned enthusiastic, there was no hint of this madness in him. After the wedding, the newlyweds did live with the bride's mother. Matthew didn't say a peep about the conditions, the modest, poor surroundings of the new house. If personal belongings were needed, he'd go to his parents' house and haul huge bags of groceries, delicacies, and high-end drinks. He and Isabella slept in a small bedroom, the former den of the Three Bears, which was now occupied by a huge marital bed. Isabella still forgot everything as soon as her husband closed the door to their bedroom. 6 months later, she realized she was expecting a child, and when the doctor announced at the ultrasound that there would be twins, she was terribly surprised. "My God, Matthew, where did this miracle come from?" Her husband smiled reassuringly at her. "So I have a twin mother. It's a genetic thing. Now we've been blessed with this good fortune." For the first time after the birth of Tom and Tobias, he was the most caring and attentive father. He shared the household chores with her equally, even learned to wash dishes and cook porridge. A year later, Isabella felt uneasy again. She felt sleepy in the evenings. The smell of fried fish made Isabella dizzy. The doctor's verdict: "You're pregnant again." She and Matthew greeted the news with enthusiasm. By then, Matthew's parents had gone abroad on a diplomatic contract. They would not be crowded now. The family decided to move into his parents' apartment next door. Moreover, Amelie had not been feeling well lately. Christian was getting tired of taking care of his grandchildren. He was sneaking pills while the children were out of sight. The power of Matthew's mother's genes was very strong. In due time in the family appeared another twins, this time girls Maggie and Megan. To give credit to Mother Nature, she did not rest on the children of Matthew and Isabella. The kids managed to take from their parents all the most beautiful features. The brothers had blue eyes and black hair like their mother. The sisters had huge eyes the color of milk chocolate and golden curls. Their figures were 1-to-1, modest from their early childhood. Age's sores never clung to this quartet. Their disposition was good-natured, their character mischievous, fond of mischief and invention. But all four were not capricious but genetic. Isabella's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden braking of the bus. "I'm sorry, I almost missed the address you gave me," the little driver apologized. But there was no reason to scold him for it. Redwood Village. All the houses stood far apart, like people sometimes showing urban loneliness. Some man walked past their van, limping, casting a hard, scrutinizing glance at their expedition. "This place isn't friendly," Isabella thought. "I have found the local controller." The things were quickly transferred to the new dwelling, and the children went to inspect the house. Isabella suddenly felt intolerably hungry. She frantically searched through her bags for a bag of bagels while she gnawed on the bread gut. There was a knock at the door just as the bagel was in her mouth. Isabella went to open the door to the uninvited guests. The same limping man stood on the doorstep, holding a basket. There was a knock on the door and Isabella opened it. On the threshold stood the limping man with the basket. "Good evening, my hosts. My name is Jasper. I'm the village chief," he introduced himself. "You can get the documents for the house with all the seals tomorrow at the village administration. In the meantime, I have brought you milk, sour cream, eggs, fresh bread from our bakery. The store is closed today. You'll need all this from the road. You have children with you." Isabella was a little taken aback. She didn't know anyone at her new place of residence, and here she was welcomed. She accepted the basket of supplies from Jasper's hands. She had so hastily and nervously packed the apartment that they had no supplies except a few bagels and half a jar of frozen apricot jam. Going into the house, Jasper refused. He turned around a little awkwardly on the porch and said one last thing. "The stove in the house is working. I've been checking, and it'll make eggs or scrambled eggs for the boys too." Isabella turned around helplessly from which side to approach the Russian stove. She had no idea. Jasper understood without words. "What's your name, mistress?" "Isabella," the woman answered. "Don't worry, Isabella. I'll show you how to use this machine. It's not difficult." Half an hour later, the stove was crackling cozily with dry wood, which Jasper had cleverly arranged in an intricate arrangement. Eggs were smoldering on the table, and the four young robbers were already spreading sour cream on the bread, drinking warm, steaming milk from mugs Isabella had found in a nearby box. After a hearty supper, the children piled into the far room, where the beds were wide. The woman laid out the bedclothes on the run. She didn't even have time to notice where her assistant had gone. Isabella herself got the bed. It was surprisingly wide and comfortable. When she lay down, she thought she would fall asleep with her head barely touching the pillow. but insidious memories crowded her again. Matthew bored abruptly at half a word, averting his eyes to the side, said, "I have a business trip to Miami, where they are opening a new facility in the village." Isabella, of course, had no idea about her husband's new addiction. Previously, he was only slumbering passion for gambling, but now it flared up, drawing him to the gambling tables of the casino. On a business trip to San Diego, Matthew was in San Diego for a week. He came back elated. He flew in, bought Isabella and the kids presents, said that he received a bonus for successful work, and it did not occur to her that her husband brazenly lied, spending another big winnings. This trip was followed by a series of other trips. Matthew invariably returned glum and gloomy, but Isabella never thought that her luck had turned away from her husband. It came as a thunderclap when it was discovered that Amelie had cancer. The operation was taken to do in Germany, but the German doctors asked for an unaffordable price. Isabella didn't have that kind of money. Matthew refused to help. There were no new orders from clients at work. Where am I going to get that kind of money? Amelie's grip on the disease was deadly. The woman was weakening before her eyes. Isabella tossed between two houses and then could not stand it, asked her mother-in-law for money. They did not refuse. Satisfied with the result of negotiations, she flew to tell Matthew the news. His reaction was strange. "Where did you get this money from? My baby, my girl, my goddess. I'll withdraw the whole amount from the bank myself. Don't ask your parents, you'll find out what a clever girl you are. My treasure, my reward." As luck would have it, all the twins got a viral infection at the same time. They were feverish, cranky, coughing, and snotty. Isabella got all the information from her mother-in-law about the money transfer and sent her husband to the bank. He disappeared for 2 days. He returned home gloomy. He announced on the doorstep, "Isabella, I've been framed. Now I owe serious people a lot of money. I'm leaving New York for a while and I won't even tell you where." Things have gone too far. Matthew couldn't hide from the criminal creditors. A week later, operatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at his parents' apartment. Isabella was invited to identify the body of an unknown man found in the Hudson River. She walked to the morgue as if she were going to an execution, on wobbly legs. A creepy institution with blue, purple, neon lights, rows of shiny metal tables everywhere, on one of which Matthew lay. She recognized him at once. Her heart felt like it had plummeted into an abyss. Beautiful brown eyes were closed. The mole on his neck that she loved so much caught her eye. "Why should I suffer this agony?" her soul screamed. "My beloved, my best, my only, my kin." There were no tears for some reason. It seemed as if everything inside had turned into an icy stone. It wouldn't melt, wouldn't budge. Isabella Machine signed all the necessary papers, dryly asked when her husband's body could be buried. "The investigation is underway. We'll let you know later when the burial can take place." This nightmarish day did not end with the terrible news of her husband's death. Isabella first called Matthew's parents to tell them the tragic news. The father-in-law, even at such a sorrowful moment, could not escape from distant wanderings to his homeland. Matthew's mother could not even speak from grief. She refused to fly over, saying, "I want to remember my boy alive. You there yourself take care of a decent send-off." The end of the chain of fateful events was a sharp deterioration of Amelie's condition. Isabella did not dare to ask her mother-in-law for money again. Mother was put in the hospital. Now she existed only on painkillers. There were many people at Matthew's cremation. Isabella only knew a few of his co-workers. There were 100 of them here. The faces were mostly unfamiliar to her. A close friend of her husband's helped with the funeral. Not so much a friend as a partner in the law business. No matter how she looked at it, her Matthew wasn't the most distinguished professional. Many appropriate speeches were made, and Isabella kept thinking about what the investigator had asked her. Did he have any enemies? She did not know the answer, but she was sure that her husband's death was connected with his addiction to gambling. Isabella did not even ask herself where the large sum of money sent by her husband's parents had gone. Amelie had not lasted long after Matthew's death. With 4 children in her arms, Isabella had no way to get her mother to foreign clinics. And the doctors said the time was irretrievably lost. So Isabella took Amelie's mind back home. Mom had changed a lot, turned into a sickly, lightweight, like a tiny Thumbelina. She had hardly eaten anything for a long time. So a couple of spoonfuls of liquid broth inside her all organs were affected by a malignant tumor. Every movement was a feat for a Mully. The disease she could not overcome. Even before that, Isabella moved back in with her mother. The huge apartment without Matthew seemed to her like a gloomy crypt. Everything reminded her of him. It was unbearable. After the departure of two people very close to her, she lived for a while as if in a vacuum, with the children and the house like a robot. It turned out that Matthew still maintained the family quite well. Because Isabella never became a teacher of Russian language and literature, she was a housewife. Somehow their previous environment became completely unbearable. The walls in the apartment she had once loved pressed on her, and the ceiling seemed low. In the kitchen, the old tulle curtains and curtains with flowers irritated her. She wanted to rip them down and stomp on them. Isabella realized one day that if she didn't move out of this place, her life would remain dull and hopeless. The apartment, though on the outskirts of New York, which had almost become a neighborhood close to the center, cost a lot of money. Isabella had no savings, no inheritance from rich relatives. The decision to sell everything and find a place to live somewhere within 300 kilometers of the city matured rapidly. House in the village Birchwood realtor, looking for a buyer for her apartment, found quickly. She refused to even go to see it. For some reason, she believed the pictures right away. She was attracted by a rivulet flowing half a kilometer from the future shelter. Isabella liked the pretty forest and the smooth rows of birch trees on its outskirts. The paperwork was done in a matter of days, and there were no delays anywhere. Isabella estimated that the proceeds would be enough for her and her children for the first time, and then she would look for a job as a teacher in the local school, or a kindergarten teacher. Communicating with her sons and daughters revealed to her the truth: she loves the kids very sincerely, truly. She is interested in the older kids. If Matthew were alive, she'd have twins and she wouldn't hesitate for a second. Isabella smiled. It brought to mind an incident in Emmett's life, who didn't miss a single living thing in the yard, from the big dogs to the brightly colored ants that lined the path from the manhole to the bushes. The janitor's vain attempts to disperse the industrious insects provoked fierce resistance from Emmett. He made bridges out of cardboard to cover the ant kingdom so no one could step on it. So Isabella belated every stray lesser brother in the neighborhood and offered to pick them up for the neighbors. And then drove Isabella and Matthew to hysterics in general. He walked into their room with a serious look on his face and asked, "Dad, Mom, don't swear, but I have a big favor to ask of you. Please give birth to a kitten from the street. You don't allow me pets. But if you're his parents, he'll be my brother, and you won't kick him out then." Matthew almost fell off the bed at such a suggestion, and Isabella, combing Tobias's curls after bathing, dropped the comb. A serious task must be answered accordingly. So the puzzled mother advised Emmett to go to their neighbor on the landing, Nellie, in the apartment across the hall. She had a gorgeous Siberian cat named Grinny for some reason. Isabella assured Emmett that Grinny's cat could be useful to him in giving birth to a kitten. Nellie worked in the trauma room of the district hospital and part-time treated all the injuries of the children in their yard. Nellie opened the door to Emmett, who had come on an important mission. Then she discussed something with him for a long time. Emmett returned home with 4 small chocolates for all his siblings and the overwhelming news. "Granny can't give birth to a kitten for me because he's a man. We men can't give birth. Also, there was a surgical invasion of his privacy, so he can't be a father to my kitten." After giving out this information, Emmett even sweated from the exertion. But he never asked Isabella and Matthew to give birth to a kitten again. It was too complicated for his notion. Isabella also thought of a funny story about her girl neighbors. That year, the playground was being renovated. The wooden slide was covered in brush. Workers had not yet had time to put a metal flat surface underneath. But had that ever stopped anyone? Maggie and Megan rolled dashingly down the rough surface, despite the danger. Megan was lucky. Maggie immediately caught a huge brush right in her soft spot. Whole delegations came to nail a crying Maggie, Isabella, and a terrified Megan in the tail. The operation lasted 2 minutes. When a sliver at least 3 centimeters long was extracted from Maggie's 5th point, Megan finally exhaled. "Mom, Aunt Nellie. Now I know what the very thing looks like." The trauma neighbor and Isabella lay on the floor, laughing. They didn't have the energy to talk. Yes, there had been many good things in her life. It was only the last 2 years that had been incredibly difficult and tragic. Things were going to get better now. Jasper walked toward his house, where the cat scratching at his heart. Being in the company of 4 boys who were so vigorous at once made him sad. The healthy shoulders of an experienced, outwardly stern and unapproachable man with kind, pure eyes would never admit to anyone that he loved children. Except that he himself to become a father by the age of 40 years with a tail never happened. Everything in this life was connected with children, remained for Jasper tragic and painful. After 2004, when Jasper together with the guys from his unit freed people in the Beastland tragedy, he came to North Ossetia by chance together with his friend Tobias, with whom he had already participated in more than one operation side by side and studied together at the Academy of Civil Service, where he was in the epicenter of the struggle for justice and a bright future. Jasper had dreamed of this since he was young, even as a child. His parents were desperate people, bikers, obsessed with motorcycles, which at that time in the USSR were not easy to get. His father was fond of heavy rock, even named his son in honor of the first letters of the Scottish rock band. He strokes the side of his iron friend, puts on a protective helmet, turns on the music, sits behind the faithful companion, and rushes through the cities and towns of a huge country. Life is not adjusted. No big deal. After Jasper was born, his mother had to settle in one of the small southern towns. They rented a house by the sea. The head of the family was only in and out of town. The winds of wanderlust overcame his thoughts of responsibility for his family. All his visits, however, he devoted exclusively to his son. Jasper grew up surrounded by steppe diversity to the sound of sea waves. Already in kindergarten, he could fight back any older bully if he hurt him. At the age of 6, he joined a wushu class. The coach, paying attention to the bully boy, always defending all the weak in the group, brought him into the section. Even at all children's matines, Jasper always got the role of bogatars and brave astronauts. In the section, from a small age, he became his own. He quickly became respected even by the older kids. The level of skill in the martial art of wushu, to which Jasper now devoted all his free time, he reached quickly. Then over the years, only the colors of belts changed. Competitions were held, in which he often came out victorious, and his skills improved. At the age of 15, the guy could already fully serve himself. At home, he cooked perfectly, kept himself and the whole house clean. Visiting occasionally, parents only marveled. The house was in perfect order. The diary is full of good and excellent grades, and even in the refrigerator, fresh soup and cutlets and porridge. Not a guy growing up, but an enviable groom. Girls began to look at the charismatic, charming Jasper already in middle school. His appearance is remarkable. The young man, as if sculpted, nature has worked to give glamour to his manly appearance. A torso, thick hair, and steely gray eyes to keep the image from being too harsh. Mother Nature finished with a smile and rewarded Jasper's face with mischievous dimples. It seemed that with such a guy, as behind a stone wall, all the girls in the village. And they weren't wrong. At 16, Jasper fell in love. He had the misfortune to choose the wrong one. He fell in love with a girl who practiced choreography in the same club as his wushu section. This creature was sophisticated, aristocratic. Bow lips, blue eyes, blonde curls tied with a blue ribbon. She spoke, stretching her words slightly and pausing meaningfully. "Jasper, what kind of shirt are you wearing? A man with your musculature shouldn't be wearing yellow." It wasn't until a month later that they switched to you. Jasper hadn't even dreamed of kissing his date. She was fragile, she'd fall apart. But he silently circled around his dream, suffering in silence. He carried bouquets of wildflowers to every date, and she graciously placed them in a painted jug on the veranda. Then she agreed to a couple hours of walks, all the while striving to get back to the choreography machine. 2 years passed. Another gentleman in Jasper's place would have gone mad with the storm of warring desires, but he bravely endured it all. A few times they kissed, almost like pioneers. That was his entire love crop. When Stacy turned 18, he went matchmaking on his own, without parents or friends. The girl lived with a rather prim mother and grandmother, always dressed in slightly old-fashioned dresses and sundresses, with strange hairstyles and faces without a single touch of makeup. Jasper then thought, not modern relatives, it's not a problem. I don't have to live with them, but with my dream. There are all kinds of people. This is not yet the most unusual option. On the proposal to marry him, Stacy, to the complete amazement of Jasper, responded with consent. Her mother and grandmother nodded with a smart, solemn look. They canceled the lavish wedding feast and decided it would be better to use the money to organize a honeymoon trip. That way the young people could get to know each other better. Jasper counted the days and hours until the date set in August. He booked a hotel in a seaside resort. The parents paid for 2 weeks in the hotel, thinking that it would be the best gift for the children on their wedding day. The groom after school at that time was already working at a construction site, working hard as a bricklayer. The bride was all in art. Having received a certificate, she entered the School of Culture at the dance department. Neither could boast of high earnings. Jasper and Stacy were married at the township hall. The table was set in the yard of Jasper's parents' house. The territory of a cozy gazebo, a barbecue, and a large wooden table allowed it. The guests were few 5 guys from Jasper's martial arts section and strong girls from Stacy's dance group. Yes, parents on both sides, including Grandma. Before the vacation, the newlyweds reached Isabella, burning with impatience. Finally, he could be with his chosen one. Stacy didn't seem to care at all about Jasper's inner turmoil about their wedding night. It was as if it wasn't an important part of a strong marriage at all. Jasper dared not discuss it with her, or anything else for that matter. He was always in a stupor when it came to this side of their relationship. He sincerely thought of Stacy as not a roommate and himself as not a whole man. He agonized, how am I going to be with this delicate, fragile creature? What if I do something wrong? Before the wedding, the guys in the section laughed at him. Jasper, how will you handle your ballerina? No one around him knew that the poor guy had already gone to another city for the weekend, met a funny girl in a bar, and spent 2 days with her in her cramped apartment. The lead singer had absolutely no complexes in matters of love. In 48 hours, Jasper had learned all the science from A to Z. He was afraid of appearing inexperienced in front of Stacy and kept his voyage, which he didn't consider shameful, hidden from even his closest buddies. He wasn't a womanizer, much less a womanizer. That was his only misstep. He couldn't explain to himself why he didn't want Stacy to be his first. It was as if his gut was telling him not to. The hotel struck the young men with its splendor. The first floor was full of cafes, restaurants, stores, and beauty salons. Their 2-room suite overlooking the sea had such mesmerizing views that it was breathtaking. And what was the outdoor swimming pool like here? You wouldn't want to go to the sea. Stacy still showed no excitement about the scenery around them, and at the restaurant for dinner she only picked at the appetizingly fried fish with her fork and took a couple of sips of white wine. Jasper could think of nothing but the fact that he would soon be alone with his beloved. Everything that happened in the room left him with a double impression. On the one hand, what he'd been waiting for over 2 years had happened, but Stacy was somehow bland, obeying him in everything. No emotion, like a doll. She got up like a robot and went to wash up. It was nothing like he'd imagined it would be. What was so much mystery about it? On the other hand, he wondered endlessly, was I so bad as to disappoint my young wife so much the conversation they had had before their first wedding night also puzzled him. I understand perfectly well, Jasper, that it is my duty to fulfill my marital duty. But for God's sake, don't talk about children, and don't forget to use protection. In fact, take care of it yourself. In my line of work, having offspring is nonsense. Pregnancy and childbirth would ruin my flawless figure forever. The first pebbles of doubt they dropped resoundingly to the still empty bottom exploded in Jasper's head into 1,000 shards. He was still very much in love with his graceful dancer, but the insidious germ of doubt had taken its first roots in his soul. Then they bathed a lot in the sea and pool, walked along the promenade, as he dreamed, rode the cable car, went to cafes and restaurants. Stacy ordered only diet food. She could munch on a leaf of greens thoughtfully all evening. She reasoned that fatty meats and cheeseburgers were a disaster for a dancer, and she would refrain from grape wine, there are so many calories in it. I ironically looked at the large portions of dishes that Jasper ordered for himself. He sighed furtively, all right, I guess it's all right for you as a man. I'll abstain. At night, Stacy was not exactly cold, but somehow indifferent, like an inevitable job. She didn't wrinkle her nose, but she didn't enjoy it. Jasper was confused, thinking frantically, we've known each other for so long. And I've been such a blind, stupid, lovesick ass. I don't know this seemingly lovely woman who is now sitting across from me at a table in a restaurant. The 2 weeks which were to be the crowning of their long romance for Jasper dragged on with unexpected agony. They came home, not in a quarrel, but in a strained relationship. It was as if a cat had run between them. To all her oddities, characteristic of many women, Stacy was not at all adapted to household chores. The only things she could manage were the coffee she brought to Jasper's house from her own supplies, scrambled eggs and fried potatoes. But she had them burned to black coals. The soups were liquid and tasteless. The sink was perpetually filled with unwashed dishes. Jasper's closet was scary to look at after laundry. Seeing all these domestic metamorphoses, Jasper clutched his head. "Stacy, don't make us anything for dinner. I'll come home from work and do it myself," Jasper said. Stacy was glad that her husband had decided to do this. She flew back from the School of Culture satisfied, filled with news about performances and premieres. Was her husband hungry after a hard shift? She did not care at all. At this time in the life of Jasper began to change. An old battle buddy of their coach came to the wushu class. They whispered about something in the locker room for a long time, and then Jasper and 3 other boys were invited into the office. The guest once again scrutinized all 4 of them, and then offered them to study at the academy, not forgetting to mention that it was definitely voluntary. "We are looking for young cadres with perfect physical fitness. The training will last 5 years. You will have to study in New York," he said. The words of the army friend and their trainer were immediately imprinted in Jasper's mind as if they had been hammered in with a sledgehammer. He knew at once that he wanted to study at the place he'd been offered, even if he had to divorce Stacy. The most interesting part of his love story was that his wife didn't even seem to understand what her spouse was trying to tell her. She silently listened to his desire to go to New York, to the academy. Shook her head with smooth blonde curls, waved her eyelashes, and rushed away to measure a suit for some regular premiere. They divorced in absentia when he was already 3 months in New York, because he did not want to get old. His parents were still traveling across America on motorcycles, and his ex-wife was learning another PAs. Amidst all these events, Jasper was learning the science of being brave, ruthless to his enemies, steely as the strongest metal or alloy. After graduating from the academy, he was assigned to the Caucasus, and together with a mysterious friend, Greg, who was a completely reckless guy. His superiors had no time to give him a command, and he was already in the thick of it. Nothing would take him. And in Besiege, he died dragging 2 guys out of a burned-out gymnasium. Jasper rushed to him, grabbed the girl and the boy, and carried them to the exit. Here's the rest of the edited text. Jasper was wounded when he had already moved a few meters away from where his comrade had died. He couldn't stop and close his eyes either, so his friend's frozen stare at the ceiling in the corridor of the besieged school sometimes haunted him in the dead of night when he couldn't sleep. Jasper had been wounded in the kneecap. The leg had failed him. He only shrieked slightly before he sat down gently on the floor and cradled the frightened little ones against him. Someone's hands picked the school children up off the floor again like a baton. Or maybe it was the blood on the floor and walls that made everything seem bright purple to him. Jasper shook his head unhappily and thought, "What the hell is this? I've only spent an hour with the new residents of Berrywood, and already so many scraps of memory from the nooks and crannies." He really didn't like to remember those tragic days. The eyes of those who searched in the general chaos for their loved ones. The medical staff at the hospital, where at first the surgeon had categorically stated that his wound was quite unfortunate. He vaguely remembered those medical terms and verbose arguments escalapa. Remembered the verdict of the old man: the leg would be better to amputate above the knee. Inflammation will go to the thigh. We'll have to cut further. He was extremely lucky that then in the operating room came an elderly woman doctor with a long experience of working with wounded soldiers. "I'll take him. We're not going to do any amputations. First, I will do what I think is necessary, and time will show which of us will be right," she said. More than 10 years had passed since then. Jasper was discharged after his injury. His leg still gave him a stubbornly persistent pain. He was even given a disability group without question. He taught for a while, but he couldn't stand in the classroom for long. His restless parents died on their old motorcycle 3 years ago. They decided to shake old times at a gathering of veteran bikers. The track was wet after a rainstorm, and they didn't make it into a tight turn. They left on the same day. The mother right at the scene of the accident, the father 2 hours later in the hospital. His parents' injuries were incompatible with life. But Jasper knew that his ancestors wouldn't have wanted a better death for themselves together, side by side, in the arms of their iron horses. Jasper didn't want to stay in his hometown any longer, so he moved closer to London, where many of his fellow servicemen had settled. In the village of Little Wilmington, he had a good life. He received a decent government paycheck. He was also surrounded by many lonely elderly women, who always invited him to help out on their allotments. They paid him with natural products, fresh eggs straight from under the laying hens, dairy products from cows, homemade pies of their own baking. So he lived well, but only at the sight of children he became sad. He didn't want to have children of his own. And now, apparently it was too late. Isabella and the twins settled into their new home in Berrywood surprisingly quickly. It was as if they'd lived there for 100 years. At first, the woman could not understand how it happened. She was not the one who built the house. And yet she felt as if she knew every centimeter of the house. A chatty neighbor told her that this house belonged to very unpleasant people, as she put it, intellectuals to the bone, descendants of some Russian aristocrats. But the former owners did not talk much about their past. They spent a quiet old age in this dwelling, and then, when their strength was no longer the same, they moved to the city, closer to their children. A neighbor said that their ancestors had lived there before, but she had no information about that. Isabella's family moved to Berrywood at the beginning of the summer, as soon as the household was in relative order. The woman immediately went to the local school and kindergarten, but she was disappointed there were no vacancies for her teaching profession. There was not enough work for the villagers themselves, who were mostly surviving on subsistence farming. After some thought, Isabella decided to follow their example. The same neighbor presented her with a mini chicken with ears, and she refused to take money for the bird. "Did you buy it? We'll get even somehow else in this world," she grumpily waved away. "So if I run out of salt and sugar, you won't give me a little of it from your stock?" grumbled the neighbor. "Come on. I'll show you how to organize the henhouse better." Isabella had a strange relationship with Jasper. The woman felt that he was happy to be in their house, to play with the twins. The twins themselves reciprocated with joy. First, they had patched the porch together after Amelie, the Skid Row enthusiast, had hurt her foot somewhere. Then they did something together on the roof. Isabella at first tried to keep the whole group off the roof, but Jasper said, "Their safety is my responsibility." And somehow she was at ease, trusting him. After the noisy chores, they went to the river. Jasper showed them where among the reeds there was the most convenient entrance to the water on the soft silt bank. After bathing, Isabella sat on the bank and admired how deftly Jasper swam far from the shore, leaving behind him an even line of small waves formed by the strokes of his strong, naked arms. She was for the first time surprisingly calm around this somewhat sullen, unspoken man. Sometimes she listened involuntarily to his conversations with the children. Without a shadow of irony, he taught them the proper way to stay on the water or wield a hammer. He smilingly instructed the girls on the best way to approach a chicken to get fresh eggs for breakfast. The pinnacle of their enthusiasm was a hike into the woods to get their first strawberries. Jasper showed them such a generous glade with scatterings of sweet, juice-filled berries that they were silent for a long time, only clapping the strawberries. An outing for mushrooms also became a discovery. Closer to August, there were so many mushrooms under snags and fallen leaves that the twins and Isabella, who were not used to such luxury, had their eyes wide open. Everything flew into the mushroom pouch. Jasper grinned, sat them all down on a thick log, and taught them. He laid them out on a light-colored plaid spread on the ground. He familiarized all the prey with each species, mercilessly dividing the children's prey into edible and inedible parts. In the evening, all together fried the mushrooms in a huge frying pan. Then they waited for them, poured with homemade sour cream, to acquire that unique flavor, which is inherent only in forest meadows. Jasper looked at the stove and said to Isabella, "Let me restore the old lady a little. I haven't noticed how fall has arrived. We need to get her cleaned up so we don't have any problems with her. I'd love to do a little renovation myself. I don't understand anything about its structure, but I've learned how to heat it and cook. The rest is a dark forest for me," Isabella answered readily. They decided to fix the stove tomorrow. Today, Isabella would cook something hot enough to last a couple of days. We scattered the things around the nurse. Jasper came in early for the morning. He hadn't been at home lately when it came to seeing Isabella and her children. He'd been running around like he was on a date. He tempered his ardor, and then admitted to himself the very thing that you, for the first time in so many years, you feel good, warm and cozy next to a woman. When was the last time you paid attention to the female sex? You probably can't remember. Isabella and the boys' house was all ready for the important process of renewing the stove. Jasper brought Believa tools to clean the chimney. The work went on briskly. Tom, Tobias, Maggie, and Megan were pouring out with joyful laughter every time the soot-stained face of the foreman turned toward their friendly foursome. Having finished inspecting the interior, they set about decorating the exterior. Jasper looked closely at the almost flat surface of the stove barrel, and his gaze caught on some protrusion, barely visible to the naked eye. "What the hell is that?" he wondered aloud. Isabella came closer, and while Jasper went to wash up, she cleaned off the bump with a kitchen knife. The stove was going to be plastered over now anyway, to smooth out the unevenness. Instantly, a handful of old plaster spilled onto the floor, and a small hole opened up. Curiosity took over. Isabella began to excavate the hole, rotating the knife clockwise. A couple minutes later, Jasper came back into the room. "What is this?" The man was surprised to see a whole empty cavity in the stove behind the shining masonry. There should never have been any such holes in a Russian stove. In the meantime, Isabella slipped her hand into the opening and found something cold and dusty, covered with a layer of mossy growth. She picked up something small and round with her fingers and pulled out a dull yellow round thing. On first inspection, it was clear that it was an ancient coin. The woman put her hand back into the furnace lair and determined by touch that there were many such round coins behind the supposed brickwork inside. Jasper, meanwhile, was already scrubbing the first trophy from the dirt. "I'm no good at this," he whistled, though we had a class at the academy on precious metals and other valuable objects. "Your find seems to be a gold coin of the Tsar's minting." At the General Family Council, it was decided to dismantle the masonry and see what other surprises it hides behind it. It was said, done. The stash in the stove gave them 67 coins. Even through the dust of time, they were of different denominations. Jasper secretly watched to see how the lady of the house would react to the unexpected treasure. Isabella was perfectly calm, marveling with everyone else at every coin that had been removed. No greedy gleam appeared in her eyes. Not even thoughtfulness was written on her face. Jasper remembered a story about another small treasure. Once, while still in the Caucasus, they had found a pot with a few gold coins in it. One of the locals quickly prepared a soap solution and told everyone to be patient. The next day, the coins in that pot shone in the sun like new. After ordering the children to fetch a basin from the corridor, Jasper began to work on the stove, removing all the old bars of bricks, cleaning them of clumps, checking the inside again, and bricking up the hole. The former site of the treasure. Isabella at this time washed us, scolded us, put the coins on the white bottom of the dish, poured it all with warm water from the kettle. She did not even think about what to do with the acquisition. Jasper's question distracted her from her chores. "What will you do, madam, with the inheritance from the past?" She did not hesitate a moment. "I'll take 7 coins, and the rest will give to the state." The man thought to himself that he would do the same. He and Isabella looked at the wonders of the world with the same eyes. An epiphany flashed through his mind. He realized who Isabella reminded him of all the time. The comparison was strange. It seemed to him like the beautiful oriole bird he had so often met in the woods. The caring mother oriole always hovered around her nest, which looked like a small wicker basket, and tended to her chicks, eagerly opening their beaks in anticipation of food. It was a golden nest, and Jasper suddenly thought that the other woman would have stashed the coins away and taken them out one by one from time to time. But this woman had thought that she would not eat of other people's goods. She decided to give her find to the authorities without complaint. That's odd. The whole company spent the rest of the evening working with the coins with enthusiasm. Jasper finished the job with a match. The children watched the process of washing the coins in the basin. The profile of Emperor Nicholas II was already clearly visible there. On other coins, the double-headed eagle, the emblem of the great Russian Empire, peeped through, creating the illusion that in the basin there was some sacrament of cleansing the coins from centuries of sins. No one knew. Maybe this treasure is some mysterious family legend. By late afternoon, everyone was exhausted. Isabella heated up the nourishing dishes she had prepared beforehand. At dinner, everyone was tiredly silent, even the twins who never stopped talking. After the meal, the children sleepily drifted off to their bedrooms. Isabella went to see Jasper off. Then the unexpected happened. She suddenly put her arm around his shoulders from behind and asked, "Will you stay?" Jasper staggered back in surprise. At that moment, he realized a truth he had been shamefully hiding even from himself. He wanted this woman very much to be near him. From the first moment he'd seen her in the van and held her gaze for a long moment. Jasper turned around swiftly. Despite his injury, he felt a rush of energy, as if he'd drunk a magic elixir filled with adrenaline. He picked Isabella up in his arms as if in a fog and carried her to the bed. There had never been another man in Isabella's life but Artem. In Jasper's fate, there was Nastya and a string of casual one-night stands whose names he sometimes didn't even know or couldn't remember. In rare moments of rest, Jasper could vaguely think, "I haven't had all those women in my life that I've known before. They may not be worth a fingernail on the little finger of the one who is now serenely embracing me." Isabella's thoughts flowed smoothly in the same direction. "Did you think that your husband, who has caused you so much trouble, was the end of the world? Holy naivete. A man like Jasper is a man you should cling to and never let go of." Before dawn, Jasper whispered in Isabella's ear that it was time for him to go, but not because he wanted to. He would stay by her side forever. He had a lingering feeling that they were together now, that Isabella thought so too, that they would share all the chores equally. 2 days later, they had thoroughly laundered all 67 gold coins. Jasper and Isabella took them to the local police station. They were now only doing everything together, just as Jasper had envisioned. And it felt so natural, as if they had been living as a family for a long time. Before the process of transferring the treasure to the state, Jasper read the internet, how according to the law all the correct formalization, prepared a photo of the oven, located in the surprise, took pictures of the coins, laid out in even rows on the kitchen table. Except that the testimony of witnesses to the discovery of the treasure could not be formalized. All 4 twins were still minors and incapacitated. In the police, the whole department gathered to gaze at the miracle. The act of handing over the coins was drawn up without delay. Isabella was informed that after the evaluation of the found by experts, she will be paid a sum of money in the amount of 50% of the income received by the Treasury. According to the most modest calculations, the amount of remuneration was solid. On the way back from the district center, Jasper and Isabella were silent. Each was thinking about something else. They spoke at the same time, as if they had both made the only right decision. "I want to take the children from the orphanage," the woman began. "I want to be with you and your twins, and all the children will have," Jasper replied. Isabella had brought up the orphanage for a reason. At the end of the summer, they'd gone to the nearest town to buy backpacks and stationery. Maria and Veronica were going to first grade for the first time this year, and the more experienced boys were going to third grade. A small bus stopped near the stationery store. There were a lot of children of different ages, and there were only 2 chaperones. Irie immediately realized the boys from the orphanage were brought for notebooks and pens. She would have immediately forgotten this meeting, but she was pinned to the floor by the gaze of one boy. He looked at her children and at herself, hugging them by the shoulders. So many unfulfilled dreams of her own family, her parents, and a deep longing were in his gaze that Isabella was embarrassed and quickly led her school children away to another store. Jasper and Isabella returned to their conversation about starting a family orphanage after she received the money she was owed for finding the treasure. There was no doubt about spending the windfall to build a luxury mansion for themselves. On the contrary, they gathered a general family meeting in the presence of the twins, who happily accepted the fact that Jasper and their mother were now together, without asking too many questions. The agenda was, would everyone be willing to vote to make their family even bigger? Suggestions came in a variety of ways. "Let's look for twins at the orphanage," 2 Maggie suggested. "We'll only take boys," said Emmett and Tobias. "Guys, why don't we not make the rules beforehand?" "Your heart will tell you," Isabella asked. "I have an idea," Jasper said, embarrassed. "We need to find out in our neighborhood children's institution which of the children there is the most difficult." Isabella and Jasper felt a little uncomfortable in the orphanage manager's office. Half an hour ago, they had told the director what they wanted to do. "I can't deny that you surprised me," she replied. Children with complicated backgrounds and problems are usually rejected by prospective adoptive parents right away. Everyone wants that, if they have already decided to take such an extraordinary step. Their future children would be without flaws. She went into the archive for a long time with the cases of wards, and then brought them 5 folders. "These are my most deprived, most difficult cases. Familiarize yourself with their stories. I'll come out and give you time to make a decision." Isabella resolutely reached into the top folder, opened the cover. From the first page, the serious eyes of a boy of about 10 looked up at her. Even in the photo, there was such bitterness in them that she felt uneasy. The name was Kirill. He had been living in the orphanage for 3 years. His parents were killed in a car accident, and he himself was thrown under the wheels of the truck responsible for the tragedy. His leg just below the knee had to be amputated. There is no doubt that the boy is well adapted to the prosthesis, serves himself independently. The characterization said withdrawn, poorly socialized, sometimes aggressive. Jasper, to whom she was reading all this aloud, felt a chill run down his spine at his own memories. He glanced at Isabella, but she smiled warmly back, understanding without words. She already knew the story of his injury. "So here's the first candidate to join us." "Are you in?" Isabella asked. "I'm in. I thought you'd be embarrassed by his injury." "Not at all. I'm sure we can effect a change in his character and disposition. The children will understand our choice too." "I don't doubt that," Jasper said. Isabella pulled the next folder from the bottom for some reason and untied the straps. This time it was the file of a girl named Catherine. From the photograph, she was staring at her with attentive eyes, magnified by some kind of peculiar glasses. Age 7 years. In need of serious ophthalmologic surgery. Waiting for a quota for a place in an eye clinic. Straight A student. She's into drawing, plasticine, molding, burning. "What do you think?" Jasper said questioningly. The twins had just taken all the supplies of blank sketchbooks, plasticine, and paints up to the attic. "We'll have to climb up and bring it all back," Isabella summarized bluntly. Now 2 folders were put aside, but the potential owners of the future family orphanage did not think to stop there. The next folder immediately elicited smiles. In it lay the file of one of the 2 twin brothers, and next to it the biography of the second. However, they had them as if they were copied. The trouble with these 2 boys was that although they had been orphaned a long time ago, no one of the adopters dared to take in a family of 2, prone to petty hooliganism in their 10 years. "Our girls and boys will be happy. Let's fulfill their wish," Isabella decided at once. "Yes, Comrade Commander." Jasper sang along. There was one more folder on the edge of the table. It contained the file of 5-year-old Lucy. The girl had a disease rumored to affect the greats of this world: Socrates, Newton, Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky, Pythagoras and Nobel. Lucy's extraordinary abilities had already been noticed: phenomenal memory, the ability at her age to quickly add up 2-digit numbers. The name of the disease is epilepsy. At the time of the Roman Emperor Caesar, who also suffered from this disease, it was also called the carrion disease. Treatment was only needed to correct it. Jasper and Isabella looked at each other and said nothing. The folder moved smoothly to the others. At the same time, his mistress entered the office. "Here is the corrected text, taking into account your requirements. The children will also understand us in this choice." "I don't doubt that," Jasper said. For some reason, Isabella pulled the next folder from the bottom and untied the straps. This time it was the file of a girl named Catherine. From the photograph, she was staring at her with attentive eyes, magnified by some kind of peculiar glasses. Age 7 years. In need of serious ophthalmologic surgery. Waiting for a quota for a place in an eye clinic. Straight A student. She's into drawing, plasticine, molding, burning. "What do you think?" Jasper said questioningly. The twins had just taken all the supplies of blank sketchbooks, plasticine, and paints up to the attic. "We'll have to climb up and bring it all back," Isabella summarized bluntly. Now 2 folders were put aside, but the potential owners of the future family orphanage did not think to stop there. The next folder immediately elicited smiles. In it lay the file of one of the 2 twin brothers, and next to it the biography of the second. However, they had them as if they were copied. The trouble with these two boys was that, although they had been orphaned a long time ago, no one of the adopters dared to take in a family of two, prone to petty hooliganism in their 10 years. Our girls and boys will be happy. Let's fulfill their wish, Isabella decided at once. Yes, Comrade Commander. Jasper sang along. There was one more folder on the edge of the table. It contained the file of 5-year-old Lucy. The girl had a disease rumored to affect the greats of this world: Socrates, Newton, Dostoevsky, and Tchaikovsky, Pythagoras, and Nobel. Lucy's extraordinary abilities had already been noticed: phenomenal memory, the ability at her age to quickly add up 2-digit numbers. The name of the disease is epilepsy. At the time of the Roman Emperor Caesar, who also suffered from this disease, it was also called the carrion disease. Treatment was only needed to correct it. Jasper and Isabella looked at each other and said nothing. The folder moved smoothly to the others. At the same time, his mistress entered the office. Having looked at the folders, the director said, "I told you that it is better to choose a child not from this list. These all get rejected at once. Why go to such trouble when there are many other offers?" "You misunderstand us," Jasper replied. "We want to adopt all these kids, take them to our family orphanage in Riverside. There is a middle school and a kindergarten there. What paperwork do we need to gather to finalize all the formalities sooner?" The principal, stunned, fell silent, and when she was able to speak again, tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. "You guys are amazing. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, who would have believed it? You are making a difference in these kids' lives." Riverside is bustling with activity. Around Jasper's tall figure, the boys are busy building their own wood-fired bathhouse. Jasper has promised that everyone will be assigned their own work. Matthew is appointed foreman. His task is to distribute building materials, distribute tools to the kids, keep records of logs, nails, and other small things. The boy's pride is so great that he has almost stopped limping. The other 4 twins are exhausted that the process is not started. Especially Jasper promised to take everyone to the river in the evening. Under the apple tree, Stacy sits on the swing. She recently had eye surgery and her face is still in bandages. But they say that when the bandages come off, she'll have almost 100% vision. Amelie, Megan, and Annie are helping their mom, Isabella. They decided to bake pies with different fillings: cabbage, mushrooms, and apples, which the boys picked from an old tree in the morning. Isabella has had a hard time managing the house alone lately. By the end of the fall, they were expecting a new addition to their family. Jasper would become a father for the 10th time, and Isabella would become a mother, of course. On the thick branches of the apple tree, camouflaged by green leaves due to the coloring, sit chicks. The oriole watched the people and thought, these people have everything like us: a big nest. There is a mother preparing food for her chicks. Good attracts good. Even a small oriole knows this law. She wasn't going to teach anyone. The bird reasoned. That's why everything in their house is fine and good. The oriole looked back at her hungry chicks in the nest. "And I have to go to my babies. I have a lot of things to do. I've already been here for a long time, admiring this family idyll." Having made the last circle over the apple tree, she soared into the sky, rejoicing that there are such wonderful people in the world, living by the laws of kindness and care, like birds. "I can't go back." Barbara woke up and asked the doctor to tell her husband she was gone. As a child, Barbara was considered strange in the yard because she wasn't afraid of dentists. When other children were dragged into the doctor's office with tantrums and tear-stained faces, Barbara was eager to peer through the narrow slit of the door and see what was going on. She wasn't afraid during dental treatment. Maybe because she didn't eat a lot of sweets. Or maybe because everything that was happening aroused the girl's keen interest. She followed every movement of the doctors, and afterwards asked a million questions, flapping her naive, childish eyes. The sound of the drill, white coats, all this was an outlandish world for 8-year-old Barbara. It was no surprise to anyone that after graduating from high school, the girl firmly decided to become a dentist. All high school, she diligently prepared, learned chemical formulas, and diligently solved tests in biology. Sometimes Barbara put on a white coat at home, a cap, and imagined that she was seeing patients. She had once borrowed it from a neighbor who worked as a pediatrician at the local clinic. "What do you want to pick other people's teeth, Barbara?" sighed her mother, stirring the borscht. Well, you want to teach cranky children, parried the daughter, not taking her eyes off the book. You must be like your grandmother, grinned the woman. Only she treated livestock and farms. And you've decided to get to people, too. Barbara grinned understandingly. Grandma Angie had worked as a zoo technician in the village for a long time before she retired. Before and after, she had often been asked by the manager to come and check on the animals and attend to difficult cow deliveries. At the same time, Grandma was not shy to cover with selective profanity young graduates of the Veterinary Institute, who had just arrived at the farm and did not even know that it was dangerous to approach the cows and horses from behind. When the farm was disbanded, the tough-tongued old woman continued to be called by the locals. So as long as there were a couple of cows in the village, there was plenty of work. Angie lived where she'd worked half her life in a village near Swan. Barbara's mom, Lexi, took a different path. She didn't want to live in the village and went to the city, hoping to fit in and achieve a higher rank than honorary milkmaid. However, the city did not treat Lexi as favorably as she would have liked. The woman did not advance further than an elementary school teacher, but received a small one-room apartment in the last years of the union for seniority. The kind where the kitchen was already cramped for 2 people. That's where Barbara was born and raised. No matter how cozy it was under her mother's wing, but at the age of 15 the girl thought about living separately. But no way. The modest salary of a teacher did not allow such a luxury. Her father stayed with them for a short time. Like many truckers, he lived for 2 families, of which neither of them knew. In the end, the man simply did not return from another trip. The mother waited 6 months, and then, gathering her courage, filed for a unilateral divorce. Barbara was secretly sad. She loved her father, and she missed his care, advice, and experience. However, after such a prank, her mother did not start any new relationships. She lived with her work and her daughter. The final exams came, followed by vacations. And now Barbara stood in front of the doors of the medical school, struggling with shyness to enter. She had passed by countless times, dreaming of how she would get her student card and credits. But now the familiar outer walls seemed stark and intimidating, even though the fulfillment of her dream depended on them. It felt strange. "Hey, sophomore year?" Someone touched her elbow. Barbara turned around and saw a blonde girl with a pointy nose and strange, age-inappropriate, brightly colored hairpins. "Yeah, from the second one," Barbara replied. "Cool." The stranger glowed and clapped Barbara on the shoulder in an overly brotherly way. "At last I found someone. My name is Kate, by the way." Barbara, she introduced herself. "Like the Crimean ship Hucklack," laughed a new acquaintance. "Let's go find our group and audience." Without waiting for an answer, Kate pulled Barbara by the hand toward the entrance. Perhaps the new classmate was the push Barbara needed to take the next step toward her goal. No one she knew from high school had gotten into medical school. And she felt a little insecure here. There was a sea of new faces around. Many had come to study from the countryside. "I came from the village of Savlevo. It's 200 kilometers from here," Kate whispered in the classroom. "Where are you from?" "I'm a local. I grew up here in the city," Barbara answered. She didn't really want to be reprimanded in her first class, but her roommate apparently liked to talk. On the other hand, she needed to make new friends in the student body. "Cool. I always wanted to live in the city. But my parents wouldn't let me leave the village until I finished school." Kate rolled her eyes. Barbara stared blankly at her new acquaintance. The skirt, the blouse, the shoes that had been the trend in town last year. Bright shadows and thick lashes. Apparently fashion was delayed in reaching the hinterlands. "I want to be a beautician. That in our village no one knows how to take care of themselves, then poultices, then lapping. It's horrible." Kate said it so loudly that she caught the teacher's questioning look. When the danger passed, she expressively poked a finger with bright green lacquer on her eyelids and whispered, "I'll also be a makeup artist. See, there is already success. Girlfriends for the wedding all written out." "Yes, I'm sure you have." Barbara held back a smile, looking at the bright spots on her face. The pressure, simplicity, and naivete with which Kate communicated both repelled and attracted her at the same time. There was no frostiness of city girlfriends in her. She had a rustic, birch log-like openness that all country folk had. What are you going to do, give shots or nurse? Kate blew her bangs back and stared at Barbara questioningly. I plan to be a dentist, she answered. It's been a dream of mine since I was a kid. Oh well, you'll think of it. She waved her hand. It seemed that Kate and Barbara had gradually become friends, despite their different personalities and goals. The calm, reserved Barbara and the energetic, talkative Kate from the village formed an amusing couple. Studying in medical school was not easy, as teachers at school and Barbara's mother warned. Medicine does not tolerate amateurs, and students from the first year were seriously loaded. At times, Barbara fell asleep over her notes, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of new information. Early rises and the long drive to the institute were also exhausting. But most importantly, her childhood dream was getting closer. Unlike Barbara, Kate didn't work too hard. She often read magazines in her classes, could sleep through classes, and saw going to the institute only as an excuse to dress up. You'll be expelled after the first session, Barbara sometimes warned her careless friend. Oh, I just need a cosmetologist license, Kate said. The girls seemed to be going their separate ways, but their friendship only grew stronger. Barbara admired Kate's openness and simplicity, which she lacked, and Kate, perhaps, envied her city friend's tenacity and determination. They had fun contrasting their different personalities and views on their studies. But to get a diploma, you have to pass the exams at least satisfactorily, Barbara stopped her. I have enough knowledge for a satisfactory, Kate, the village fashionista said confidently. Kate wasn't really that lazy. She just had a different approach. Instead of cramming every day, she preferred to stay up the night before the seminar to answer without forgetting what she had read. She took notes from her roommates and kept her textbooks and manuals on the table in her room just for show. Kate was not lazy also because she immediately began to look for part-time jobs. To be more precise, they found it themselves to hand out flyers in the dormitory, or something somewhere to carry for a little money. So by the end of the semester, she was invited to work as a barista for evening shifts in a small coffee shop. Kate brewed coffee a little better than the cleaning lady, but made eyes at all the visitors and smiled. Thanks to her rustic spontaneity and simplicity, her 32 teeth left good tips, on which the girl bought cosmetics and new handbags. This rustic directness and simplicity helped her where it was more difficult for city people. Kate was not afraid to seem stupid, and it always went to her advantage. She also had her own goal, and the girl went her own way to it. Barbara always had fun with Kate. She knew the latest gossip, had a lot of funny stories to tell, and could do her friends' makeup in the bathroom before class. On one of the frosty days before the session, Barbara stood at the bus stop waiting for the bus. Several other people were crowding along with her. Time was running out, and the bus was still missing. The elderly women behind Barbara were getting louder and louder. A man in an old-fashioned fur hat, carrying a briefcase like Novoseltsev from the movie Service Romance, finally couldn't stand it and asked the driver of the next bus, "Where did the 14th route go?" "They abolished them all," he shrugged indifferently. "Now it's only a transfer to the center." Rumors that this bus would be abolished had been circulating for a long time. But as always, everything happened at the most inopportune moment. The man in the fur hat swore loudly, not embarrassing the passengers, and hurriedly began to call a cab. Clara realized that she would have to do the same to avoid being late. As luck would have it, the first pair was a seminar with a very picky professor from the Higher School of Economics who wouldn't let latecomers in. To get to the institute, Barbara gave away all her money, even scraped change from the farthest pockets. She ran into the auditorium a moment before the bell rang and, breathing loudly, plopped down on the bench next to Kate. "Where have you been?" "I was already thinking about how to get you out of school," she pounced on her friend with questions. "My bus doesn't run anymore," Barbara complained, laying out her notebook. "I don't know how I'm going to get here. It's either a detour across the city or a cab." "So you should move into my dorm," Kate said. 5 minutes and you're at school. Just remember to brush your teeth." Barbara wanted to say something against it, but suddenly realized that it wasn't a bad idea. And if she had to choose between an extra early rise and an expensive cab, Kate and the dormitory was the better option. After all, she'd wanted to live on her own for a long time. Student room fees were ridiculous. She spent more on commuting from home. And she could go to her mom's on weekends. "My roommate just moved out," So here, as they say, all the cards are aligned. Kate theatrically raised her hands to the ceiling. You'll have to apply to the building manager, and they'll move you in no time. Barbara nodded. So much time they were wasting traveling. They could have used it for more useful things like studying, walking, and getting a good night's sleep. The superintendent had been a little nagging at Barbara when she'd given her the papers. What are you doing here? I have to put up foreigners from out of town, she grumbled. The girl kept silent, knowing that she was obliged to be accommodated. The commandant once again looked at her with a keen eye, but everything was in order. Eventually, she accepted the application and gave her a check and date. As soon as they were out of the dormitory, Kate smothered Barbara in a hug so tightly that she gasped. Yay, we're together now. Her mother took the news of her daughter's future move with enthusiasm. The mother's apartment was cozy, but cramped. Alas, even a mother's love couldn't change that fact. Don't eat crap in there, Lexi admonished her daughter as she put towels and a new set of bedding in her bag. And don't drink. You're the only one who's so willful, she shook her fist rather jokingly, or that Kate, your tough friend, is going to be a bad influence on you. She's all right, Barbara defended her friend. She's just peculiar. A few days later, on a weekend, the girl came to the dormitory with her things. Kate was already waiting for her. She helped her to bring everything in, settle in, showed her where everything was. The room was small, but here Barbara had her own separate bed, a table, a closet, shelves, and a whole wall. All in all, not bad. The main thing was that it was a couple minutes' walk to the university, and she would get used to the rest. That evening, Barbara and Kate were walking down the hallway when a voice called out to them. Hello, girls. A student peeked out of a nearby room. Hi, Swan, Kate responded, tilting her head to the side as if looking at a shiny bauble. What do you want? Come join us, because we're lacking female company, he said, waving his hand invitingly. We'll feed you, give you a drink. We won't leave you with any hard feelings. It's a birthday party, after all. Barbara tugged Kate's elbow questioningly. It's Swan from third year who's been after me since the beginning of the semester, she whispered back. He's not a bad guy, but he's a little dorky. Do you want to go? Barbara took another look at the guy who was urging them on. Why not? She shrugged her shoulders. Kate stared at her. Tomorrow's Sunday anyway. No need to go anywhere. We'll sit around and talk, all of us. Nothing to be afraid of, she turned to Swan. Okay, we'll be there soon. The guy glowered, gave them a thumbs up, and disappeared into the room. Barbara studied for a while, but then she thought about it. She hadn't really made friends with anyone except Kate in the 6 months she'd been at school. Sure, she'd hung out with her classmates, but it wasn't the same. Barbara's old school friends visited less and less often and wrote shorter and shorter letters, because everyone had enough to worry about. And they didn't understand why she was going to an institute across town. Kate quickly combed her hair, changed from pants to jeans, and found a decent t-shirt in the closet. Barbara didn't bother, limiting herself to brushing her hair. There were 3 guys and a girl in the room, apparently the couple of the birthday boy, tall, thin as a pole, but very hospitable. Swan, an old acquaintance, greeted the girls and introduced the company. This is Vince, the birthday boy, and his girlfriend Susan. This is Simon, the city's future medical luminary. And this is Jasper, he said, pointing his finger at a boy sitting in a chair by the window. Matthew from the journalism department. The girls were warmly welcomed and seated at the communal table. After a while, the shyness of the acquaintance evaporated without a trace. Everyone drank, ate, joked. Susan suggested playing crocodile. The boys readily moved the bed, making room. Barbara stared blankly at all the new acquaintances. Jasper was making small talk with Kate. It was obvious that he liked her, whether he was trying to hug her, picking an invisible speck off her shoulder, or whispering something in her ear. Vince and Susan had been together a long time. It was obvious from their conversation and their warmth toward each other. Barbara felt a twinge of distant envy. She'd dated a guy in high school, but he'd never treated her with such care and warmth. Simon made occasional jokes about doctors. During breaks, when his mouth wasn't busy eating, he'd already put a couple ketchup stains on his shirt. But would that stop a man with a big appetite? Matthew, the only one Jasper had introduced differently than the others, didn't fit at the table. He sat by the window with his plate in his hands. But that didn't stop the young man from collecting all the stares. He told stories, joked, asked provocative questions, and posed picturesquely. Matthew's a talker, Vince said. He's a man who's chosen his profession to talk. The party turned into an interesting argument about professions and vocations. When Matthew spoke disparagingly of medicine, comparing it to picking on people, Barbara stood up for Simon. "What's wrong with helping people?" she asked suddenly. Everyone fell silent and stared at her with interest. Matthew also looked at her. "You're not going to help them for free, are you? Or are you going to open a branch of the Mother Teresa Society?" He sarcastically parried Barbara. "I want to help first of all. I'm going into the profession because of my heart, not because it's profitable," she said. "Okay, and you need to eat. So stop covering your ambition with mercy." Matthew waved his hand at her. "Sooner or later, people will become just a means of earning money for you. But some people will earn money by talking, and others by seeing rotten teeth and other unpleasant things in the human body." "Matthew, come on. This is the third year you've been arguing with us," Vince said conciliatorily. "All professions are needed, and all have their talents. Let's have a drink and play cards." Barbara gave Matthew an annoyed look, but didn't argue further, so as not to offend the birthday boy. The trouble was, she liked the smug talker. Matthew had the typical flamboyant appearance, chiseled facial features, dark hair, strong charisma, and a sharp mind. Gradually, the angular conversation smoothed out and the tension he'd built up went away. The party had passed midnight when there was a knock on the door. "Shooge," Vince hissed. "Commandant." Susan appeared and, cursing everyone, quickly covered the table with a sheet. Girls and boys were hidden under beds and in closets. Everything happened so fast that hardly a fly could have flown in that time. The commandant's voice was heard, reprimanding Vince for the noise and disorder after lights out, and he did his best to show the supposedly empty room. "It's like this every time," Matthew sighed, shoved into the closet with Barbara on the perfume mountain. "Auntie's here, so she'll hide everything in the closets, you idiot." The closet was cramped. Barbara felt her back resting against the guy's chest and almost stepped on his feet. For some reason, her cheeks were flaming and her tongue was confused. Matthew touched her shoulder gently as he could do while standing in a closet full of things. "I'm sorry, okay, it's my nature to pick at things." "It was rude," he said. Without turning around, Barbara replied, "Vada." She could feel the guy's guilty breath on the back of her neck. It was getting stuffy. "Let's go out tomorrow." As an apology, you pick where Matthew put his hand on her forearm. The commandant let go of the last of her nagging remarks, wagged her finger, and made to leave. Goosebumps ran up and down his body. It was hot and cold at the same time. There was tension in the air again, but it was still enveloping. "Come on," Barbara agreed. "To the contemporary artists exhibition at the gallery." "Okay. I'll be waiting at the dormitory entrance." The closet doors swung open. "So you two didn't have a fight?" Vince asked. "We did. We almost did." Matthew pulled away. He was the first to jump out, winking discreetly at Barbara. "You okay? Why would you go out with that asshole?" Kate gave the guy a hard stare. "I think we're going on a date with that jerk," Barbara whispered quietly, trying to hide her red cheeks and the stupid love sparkle in her eyes. "Barbara Vitalievna, you have golden hands." The grateful patient smiled goodbye and left the office. Barbara took off her gloves and nodded to herself in the mirror. She had gone to the dentist's office for moments like this, for grateful looks and sincere appreciation. Wasn't it a shame the years she'd spent studying? First 5 in medical school, then residency. 3 more years for the registry. Barbara took the robe home to wash. She should also call Kate. They were supposed to meet today for a professional holiday. Barbara threw on the coat, said goodbye to the girls at the front desk, and hurried to the store to get a cake. Kate still had a sweet tooth from university. No one was home for her yet. Kieran had warned that he would be at the agency until the evening. He'd started moonlighting there while he was still studying, and 7 years later he'd taken the editor's chair himself. But Kieran had connections with every authority in Swan, from vegetable shops to the prosecutor's office. He and Barbara had married while they were still at university, a year after they'd started their relationship in the dormitory party. Kate had convinced her that Kieran was good, of course, but he was too nosy. Mother and principal did not take the profession of journalism seriously. What kind of job is it, collecting gossip? Like plowing a factory or sowing grain, she used to say. But she was radiant when Barbara came for the weekend and raved about her boyfriend. Kieran was not what he seemed at first glance, nor what everyone else saw him as. He knew how to be caring and sensitive, and even restrained his desire to pick at everything. At the same time remained the soul of the company, a noisy lighter. Many girls openly envied Barbara and openly glared at Kieran when they appeared at the university. There's nothing to see. Kate waved her hands at them. They're not here for the ballet. Shoo. Though she had initially opposed Barbara and Kieran's relationship, she soon became an ardent defender of their peace, and was even a bridesmaid at the wedding. Not without pride, she told the guests that without her, the young couple would not have met. It might have seemed that Kate just had nothing to do, but those who thought so were wrong. She had affairs with 2 or 3 men at once. Never a dull moment in the evening. Sometimes she chose from several candidates and was not ashamed to use her natural beauty. Those problems that she herself did not want to solve suitors. That's how Kate finished her studies, not really knowing what she was studying for. She got her medical degree as a working makeup artist. She did not go to any residency, but sat in a beauty studio, having mastered in addition to makeup, hair and other procedures. From boredom or from power, married and 6 months later divorced. Another year Kate went on dates, and then again went to the registry office. She wasn't lazy, she was just lucky. She was also never shy about doing things that others disapproved of, so she won where others gave up. Barbara sometimes thought her road was straight and quiet, where you could see all the stops and bumps from miles ahead. Kate's road, on the other hand, wriggled like a snake, either falling into potholes or going under the clouds. The important thing was that in the end, they both reached their destination. Finally. Wow. Barbara was just about to call her friend, who was almost an hour late, when she heard a commotion in the entryway and a bell ringing. "Can you believe it, you bastard?" Kate was indignant. "The client was late, delayed me. The cabs were still running." Barbara just smiled. They hugged. It couldn't have been otherwise. Over the years, Kate had changed from a country girl with ambition into a genteel city beauty. She aspired to a brown haircut, was always with makeup, fashionably dressed. And she was more concerned about a new skirt and going for a massage than having groceries at home. "Oh, you didn't cook?" Kate asked, as soon as she entered the kitchen and poked her nose into the pots on the stove and in the refrigerator. "I see piggies." Barbara had borscht, stuffed cabbage, and compote. She didn't chase brands and hairstyles. She dressed minimalistically and simply, but she knew how to keep things cozy and on time. "I'm Simon's boo." "I don't cook anything," Kate complained. "We all have our talents," Barbara reassured her. The casual, friendly conversation went on late into the night. It was always like this when they met. The cake was almost over, and for the third time, Barbara was making coffee. When did Kieran finally come home? The young editor was in a meeting. He'd come into the kitchen, said hello briefly, hugged his wife and retired to his room, saying he'd had a hard day. "Why is he so glum?" Kate asked, glancing at the man. "Tired." I guess Barbara shrugged. "I didn't have to force him to sit at the table." Come on. Kate jumped up from her chair and reached for her friend's shoulder. "What's this?" She picked up her red hair with 2 long fingernails and showed it to the stunned Barbara. She stopped talking in surprise. "Maybe it was an accident," Barbara suggested. "Yeah, you can say it was blown in by the wind." Kate stared at her with her arms at her sides. "I'm a friend of men, I know how they smell. Came in tired, in someone else's hair. Just like he'd been working out." "Poor thing," Barbara grinned. "What are you implying? That he, Matthew, has moved on the room?" I'm not implying anything yet, but it's a fact, Kate shrugged. We need to watch him, take a closer look. And come on, maybe you had something strange going on. Barbara wondered. Her friend's suspicions had shifted the bricks of her inner fortress. Just a little, but even that was enough to make the edifice faintly shake. Matthew had replaced the father she'd been deprived of in her life. He became both friend and husband at once. For the first few years they lived soul to soul, understood each other without words, and as if a whole universe was formed in the fusion of two different characters. Then they experienced several crises in their relationship. There were quarrels, as with everyone, but they quickly became the past. The last year they lived very measured, but loaded professionally. Both worked hard to achieve their goals. Maybe they were socializing less. Barbara speculated aloud. Is everything okay in bed? Kate questioned her. Well, maybe because of the work, maybe a little less, Barbara agreed. Something's sticking. Kate nodded. It's just one hair, and already there's a lot of panic. Everything starts with a hair, said her friend with an authoritative thumbs up. I advise you to go through the pockets of his shirt, and in the laptop. I'm not sniffing shirts. What the hell are you talking about? Barbara was indignant, though subconsciously the doubt had already taken hold of her. Go to his workplace, Kate whispered conspiratorially. Maybe they've got a red-headed student intern there. They chatted for a while, and Kate started to get ready to go home. Oh, I almost forgot, she said. My salon is celebrating its anniversary. Come with your husband next week, Friday. You are my regular customer. Of course we will, Barbara nodded. Smell the shirts, Kate winked at her, gave her a kiss, and disappeared into the elevator. Involuntarily, Barbara began to look at her husband. Until Kate's words, she'd never thought of accusing him of cheating. Of course it was hard to believe, but doubts crept in. One evening Barbara did go through her husband's things. God, what am I doing? She asked herself when she actually sniffed his favorite Matthew shirt. It didn't smell anything suspicious. There was no foreign hair. Barbara calmed down and put Kate's words out of her mind. Kate is Kate, and my Matthew isn't like that. She had long ago accepted his job and the need to socialize with different people. Little did she know who the meeting might have been with. This is all silly. Mish, we're all right, aren't we? Barbara asked on the way to the cafe, not knowing why she was asking. The inner restlessness hadn't completely gone away. Yes, why are you suddenly asking? Matthew wondered. You can't tell me that Kate found a hair, Barbara thought. You've been away at work lately, and we haven't talked much. Barbara, but you know I have a lot of things to do and a lot of responsibilities. Matthew smiled. I'll get an assistant soon and relax a little. Oh. Here we are. Kate was waiting for them at the entrance to the cafe, looking drunk and in full battle paint. She was friends with the owner of the salon and had even bought out a small share of the business, so she could invite anyone to the party. Barbara sometimes wondered where careless Kate got the money, but the mystery remained a mystery. The mini-corporate party was a lot of fun. The women's company was diluted by a few men: the owner's husband, the masseur's boyfriend, and Barbara and Kate's husbands. Barbara didn't know her friend's new husband. She had only seen him at the wedding and didn't remember where he'd come from. Simon looked frankly bored. He constantly touched his champagne glass, sighed, and took part in the general festivities very languidly. The hostess raffled off certificates for free treatments among the guests. Barbara successfully won one of them and hurried to please her husband, who went outside for a smoke. She jumped out of the door and looked around puzzled. Only Kate was outside, talking on the phone. Have you seen Matthew? Her friend asked her. Kate put the phone away in her purse. Of course I have. While you were participating in the raffle, your husband poured wine on his pants and went to change his clothes, she shouted. And we have a delivery of new manicure tables. The idiots just mixed up the days. I rushed to the salon to receive, so that everything did not disrupt. Xiao. You two have fun. Kate jumped into a cab and sped away. A puzzled Barbara dialed Matthew. He confirmed that he had doused his pants, was changing, and would be back soon. Miss me? She heard a voice from behind her. Simon came out of the door. Barbara responded machine generously. No. They had said hello very crumply in the first few minutes. The girl wondered why her husband had not warned her and had left so hastily. Let's talk, shall we? Simon kept up. I don't know anyone here but you. There's nothing to talk about with these chickens in salons. They're all talking about manicures and new hair colors. He yawned tiredly and flicked his lighter. Come on, Barbara agreed, realizing she was in a similar situation. Simon asked about his work, his habits, his studies, only moving on to talk about himself. He complained about Kate overtly or covertly. Barbara knew he was drunk, but for some reason she listened. She'd never talked to someone in such a way about her friend, as if she'd been given a glimpse into a secret suitcase. She cooks once a week, and it's impossible to eat, Simon complained. I'm used to home-cooked food, Simon sighed. My mom was a cook all her life, and here Ben from morning till night, do you want borscht? Cutlets? Pie she'll buy soldiers, or say eat dumplings, honey yuck, but at night she wears makeup until 3 o'clock. Then why did you marry her? Cautiously switched to you, Barbara. She's beautiful, she's a pain in the ass. I couldn't take my eyes off her. When I saw her, everything reasonable changed in my head. But now I realize you can't eat beauty alone. Simon moved closer and whispered. I gave her money for a share in that damn salon for some reason. I thought she'd stop hanging around there and be home and earning an income. No way. Barbara felt sorry for Simon. She realized that his rose-colored glasses were broken. On the one hand, he'd seen who he'd married. On the other hand, beauty had always clouded men's judgment. I wish I had a wife like you, Barbara, Simon said, looking into her eyes. A calm, responsible, domestic wife, ready to raise children, not plaster chickens in front of the mirror. Barbara endured and climbed out of Simon's palms, who had already managed to get a grip on her fingers. I don't think this is a good idea, the girl cut him short. It's time for us to go back inside. She turned and walked quickly into the cafe. Her heart was pounding frantically. There was bewilderment and awkwardness in her mind. Barbara sat down in her seat at the table and poured half a glass of wine. Should she tell Kate what had happened? Complaints, harassment, and innuendo. Kate would start questioning him. They'll fight. They'll have to rehash the whole thing. No, let them deal with their own problems. Barbara sipped her wine and reached for a sandwich. For some reason, she felt very bad. She wanted to hug Kieran. He'd disappeared for some reason. She called. Her husband answered that he was almost there, but he was stuck in traffic. Finally, he walked into the cafe in jeans and a t-shirt. About 10 minutes later, a panting Kate burst in. She was desperately arguing on the phone with someone. What kind of idiots are these? This isn't a company, it's a silent horror. Kate threw the phone with force on the table next to her. Not only did they show up on the wrong day, but they almost hurt me. She pointed to a barely visible bruise on her elbow and an abrasion on her forearm. I'm sorry it took so long, Barbara. Kieran hugged her from behind. The traffic would drive you crazy. Why didn't you warn me? Barbara asked. I was standing in the middle of the hall with, pardon me, wet pants. Kieran waved his hands guiltily. I didn't have time to talk. I hurried to the car and rushed to change my pants. Kate continued to murmur and fuss nearby. Barbara calmed down a little when she felt her husband's hand on her arm. At the other end of the table, Simon sat silent and glared at her through the wall of a clear glass. Several days passed. Barbara was finishing up her work at the clinic. Her mood was good. The last 8-year-old patient had been a delight to her with his bravery and resilience. He even hugged the doctor's aunt goodbye. And under his mom's proud gaze, embarrassedly said thank you. Of course, Barbara could not just let the little hero out of the office and handed him a brand new toothbrush, which was left by the brand representative for promotional purposes. The young doctor had already said goodbye to all her colleagues and was standing at the door when the phone in her pocket rang. It was Kate. Help me out, come model, heard her voice in the phone. My student and I need to practice, and the model is sick, the bastard. Now? Barbara was surprised. Yes, it's urgent, Kate begged. Okay, I'll be right there. Barbara hung up the phone. She often helped her friend out. It was easy and pleasant. After all, she always came home with her makeup and hair done, and Kate's training was never disrupted. It took Barbara about half an hour to get to the salon. She was already waiting, sat in a chair, and under the popular tracks of the radio air Kate and her student began to work. The friend was scattered in another gratitude and scolded the irresponsible student model, who did not come. When the work was done and the student went home, the makeup artist offered Barbara to stay and have a cup of coffee. It turned out very favorably, said her friend, looking at the makeup. She's a smart girl. Maybe something good will come out of her. Barbara clapped her eyelashes theatrically. She turned to one side or the other. At the same time, she caught a glimpse of the old manicure and tables. I thought you said your tables were going to be replaced? She stared questioningly at her makeup artist friend. Where are they? They turned out to be defective. We sent them back. The makeup artist waved her hand. What, all at once? Barbara wondered. They all had scratched countertops. I told you, those idiot movers were banging them against each other like crazy. The makeup artist waved her hand. Pull the brushes. Fucking detectives. They only spoiled our holiday and frayed our nerves. Did they hit you with the tables too? Barbara nodded at the greenish bruise on the makeup artist's elbow. Yeah, the makeup artist didn't even look at her arm. They opened the door. As if to my home, I was sealed in for company. Friends finished their coffee and long ago switched to another topic, when the makeup artist, who was scrolling through the news feed on her phone, suddenly exclaimed, Larchik, look. She shoved a machine with a picture open on the screen to Barbara's nose. The girl looked at the picture and froze. On the photo was the entire staff of the agency where her husband worked. The guys were holding some certificates in their hands. Apparently another award from their superiors. But another thing was interesting. Next to her husband stood a young red-haired girl. Aha, shouted her friend triumphantly. And I told you to frame. I'd say so, Barbara said, looking at the photograph. I felt sick to my stomach. The nasty feeling from the conversation with her friend and her husband resurfaced again. That's from finding the red hair, said the makeup artist friend. It's okay, we exposed him. She clenched her hand into a fist. If anything, we'll be the first to file for divorce. What divorce? Barbara jumped up. Her face was burning. It's not clear yet. It's clear as day, her friend said authoritatively, folding her arms across her chest. Your husband's on the prowl. We've got to go over there and rip that redhead's hair out. Barbara clutched her temples with her hands. I don't believe in this nonsense. Okay, agreed the makeup artist. We'll watch him very carefully this week. Men always leave their fingers in the details. Barbara nodded. She wanted to hint to her friend about her boyfriend's behavior, but she didn't. She could say too much out of resentment, especially since the makeup artist was just drawing her own conclusions, a bit obsessive. But so far there was no one to take offense at or for. Barbara's husband was behaving normally. The makeup artist began to surreptitiously follow her friend's husband, something she normally never did. Until that day, Barbara thought that there was no point in restricting the freedom of a partner, forbidding something, scandals or jealousy scenes. She had realized this in her student days. Although she loved her husband very much, admired him as a man and a person. The more you control, the higher the probability of the opposite effect, she pondered. And to arrange emotional swings with yelling at her husband is a noisy and dangerous task. Scenes and emotions are enough for him at work. At home he wants peace. He said so himself. During the day, the young editor, like a chameleon, adjusted to anyone who came into his office, and in the evening at home he wanted to be himself. Feeling like a delinquent schoolgirl, Barbara rummaged through her husband's backpack, his notebook while he was in the shower. On the pages of the notebook, she found a list of phone numbers and women's names. In his jacket pocket, a strange pink-colored pen. Her heart pounded loudly, echoing in her ears like it had been covered with a bucket. What are you doing? The husband stood in the doorway, staring at his wife in amazement. Barbara froze with the evidence she had found in her hands. Are you accusing me of something? Kieran folded his arms across his chest. What is it? Barbara jabbed her finger at the list of numbers. Are these the candidates for the assistant position? Her husband shrugged indifferently. I was interviewing last week. I wrote everyone down here. What? I wrote these down. Kieran waved a pink pen in the air. First with mine. Then I ran out of paste and Stacy lent me her writing utensils. What's the problem? Why are you going through my stuff? Kieran glanced around at the slight mess on the desk. His nostrils were dilating. Barbara felt like a fool. She muttered something under her breath, slipped the notebook and pen to her husband, and left for the kitchen. His explanations were convincing, but the worm of paranoia continued to gnaw its way through her thoughts. Barbara crushed her whiskey with her hands and sat down at the table in the kitchen. She grabbed her phone and texted Kate about what had happened. The makeup artist didn't believe her friend's husband's excuses and offered to follow up with him just in case. Barbara looked at her schedule, figured something out, and texted back. Do it. Where? She went to bed late. Kieran was already on his 10th nap when she finally settled down. Before doing so, Barbara had spent a long time gazing into her sleeping husband's face, trying to find answers to her questions in him. In the morning, she got ready, pretended nothing had happened, walked Kieran to work, and waited for Kate. Her friend arrived just as Kieran rolled out of the yard. Dunkate's voice was filled with a poorly concealed excitement, as if she'd been waiting a long time for permission. I have a choice. Look, Barbara looked at her. Put your seatbelt on in the car. Well, you might not like what you see if you see anything, Kate corrected herself, shrugging. But I'd rather not see anything, of course. He's gotten kind of distant, Barbara murmured as they caught up with Kieran on the road and pulled a few cars ahead of them. He seemed fine, but something was wrong. That's how it starts, Kate nodded, gazing down the road. First they're in love, and then they start lying. They can't fool our feminine instincts. Did your previous husband cheat on you? Barbara suddenly blurted out for some reason. Kate jerked faintly at the wheel, so caught off guard by the question. Sami, was he cheating? Very likely, she said uncertainly. But I didn't care. I went on dates. I realized I was sick of Sammy. I wish I'd told him when I'd filed for divorce in bed. Aren't you afraid that Simon might cheat on you? Barbara was so emotional she could barely contain the urge to tell the truth. Simon? Please. Kate waved her hand, instantly relaxed. He's head over heels in love with me, like a dog, always waiting. Is he that in love? Barbara muttered to herself so Kate wouldn't hear. They pulled into the parking lot outside Kieran's work. His car was already there. There was a long ambush ahead. Kate promptly ran to the nearest stall for coffee and scones. Napping in the car took until lunchtime. Kate nudged Barbara in the shoulder as Kieran came out of the agency with the red-haired girl from the photo. They got into the car and got ready to drive out. Let's go, lovebirds. We'll get them now, Kate muttered excitedly, twisting the steering wheel. Barbara watched her husband's car with bated breath. She recognized the girl in the photo. Kieran had said it was his assistant. But was it just that? The answer to that question loomed somewhere on the horizon. The editor and her companion made a trip to the city's utility and stationery store. On the whole, there were no provocative moments, except for opening the door for the girl. She carried a folder with documents, sometimes asking Kieran something or answering the phone. He hardly ever took his eyes off the phone, even while driving. Yeah, he's holding the door for you, just in case Kate noticed Kieran's gesture, almost mockingly. He always does that, Barbara replied, following her husband with her eyes. Look, why don't you call him right now, Kate suggested. Ask him what he's doing and see what the answer is. Barbara dialed the number and waited. Kieran's phone was busy, but he switched the call almost immediately and picked up. Hi, did you pick up lunch? She blurted out. Hello? No, I'm eating in the cafeteria. Don't worry, her husband answered in a completely calm voice. All right, Barbara stretched out. How's the day? Are you socializing for work? Yes, came the reply. Why are you calling? No reason Barbara lied, suspecting that her husband had suspected something. "I'll see you tonight. Bye." Kate listened to the conversation with her arms folded across her chest. He didn't say he was traveling with a woman. She waggled her eyebrows expressively. "He's hiding, all right." Her wooden confidence pierced the last shield of doubt in Barbara's chest. Why the hell does he even need an assistant? Kate snapped her hands together in indignation. It was like he'd spent 2 years cooking and doing everything himself. And here, all of a sudden, the ambition of the head of the brain. "I don't know," Barbara said, staring blankly out the window. "Tired, I guess." "Yeah, from work or from his wife," Kate said wryly. Kate drove home, leaving Barbara alone to deal with the aftermath of the evening. "Are you white or red, drinking?" Kate asked mischievously before leaving. That evening, Kieran found the 2 drunken girlfriends at home. Barbara couldn't get Kate out of the house for about an hour. She asked for a drink for a nightcap. Then she was hugging. Then she lost something in her bag. Finally, Simon arrived and took his raging wife himself. He cast an interested and questioning glance at Barbara, and they left. At that moment, her husband seemed to Barbara the best and most innocent. She fell dreamily asleep, hugging her pillow, whispering something with only her lips. Kieran sat in the chair and waited for his wife to fall asleep. He did not scold her, did not lecture her. He only set the alarm clock, put a couple of pain pills on the table, and put a glass of water. Then he went out, hesitating briefly in the doorway, as if in doubt. But the second confusion lasted only a moment. The man looked at the sleeping Barbara, nodded to himself, and closed the bedroom door. After that evening, Barbara became nervous and irritable. She began to be late for work. For the first time, Barbara snapped at a patient who drove to her from across town. "Barbara, why don't you take a vacation?" The receptionist girls at the front desk asked sympathetically. "Can I take a vacation?" the doctor replied, wrinkling her forehead tensely. She was beginning to notice a cooling in her and Kieran's relationship. He hugged her dryly. He forgot the usual little things, or he dropped her calls and returned them himself. Barbara remembered the way the other female students had looked at him during their studies. Kieran had always stood out. He was passionate, charismatic, had a great sense of humor, and a sharp mind. Next to him, she sometimes felt she was falling short. Over the years, Kieran has not lost any of his appeal, and even became brighter. "You've got a paycheck today. Go to the mall, buy yourself something, a dress, shoes, and the mood will improve," advised a colleague Barbara. It was a good idea. In all the commotion, she had almost forgotten that it was the height of summer, and that she didn't have to be cramped in stupid jeans and the infamous t-shirts. Barbara called Kate and suggested that they go shopping together after work. But her friend cited busyness and declined. At the mall, the windows were full of sales and posters, mannequins towering between the rows of clothes. Barbara remembered the pants and styles of dresses Kate had recommended to her the day before and began to walk along the racks. After choosing a few options, she went to the fitting rooms. What a pleasant surprise. She heard behind her as she came out to assess her outfit in the large mirror in front of the booths. Barbara turned around and saw Simon. The man had wandered into the mall, apparently for the same reason I had. A closet update, she thought. "Well, this is a surprise," Barbara grumbled. "Hello, Simon. The dress fits perfectly." The boy gave her a thumbs up. "Take it, don't hesitate." This time he was fresh and had a positive attitude. Old memories that had lived along with his appearance slid unpleasantly down her back. "Barbara, I wanted to apologize," Simon began, putting his hands behind his head shyly. "I got drunk in that cafe because I was nervous and tired. I was talking nonsense. I'm sorry, I acted like a total asshole." Barbara was surprised, pleasantly surprised. "It happened," she said. "What are you doing here?" She glanced at the store, as if to confirm the question. I closed the deal nervously, exhaled at work, and decided to buy myself a long-standing dream. I wanted a computer. Simon nodded at the bag from the hardware store. And the new jeans were a bonus. Barbara looked at the jeans appraisingly. "Don't think twice about getting them too." She smiled slightly. Even this sudden company in Simon's face was good for her for some reason. Maybe it distracted her from her obsessive thoughts. Maybe she needed a counselor, or maybe it was something else. Kate's all worked up, and she won't come with me, he said as they left the store. Busy with me today, to Barbara confirmed. How about some coffee? Or was there something else you wanted to buy? Barbara thought that the underwear shopping would have to be postponed, and nodded in agreement, approving the coffee idea. In the cafeteria, she tried to pay for it herself, but Simon was the first to arrive and put a fragrant drink and a small dessert in front of her. Barbara hadn't ordered the latter. Oh, come on. As a friend of a best friend, Simon said, we're practically related. He didn't have time to say anything before he heard a text message from the bank. Why? Simon stared sourly at Barbara, looking at the balance on the card. Almost, but not related, she commented briefly. They chatted, then went back down to the shopping floors and wandered for a long time, picking out one pretty thing or another. Barbara felt that she was enjoying Simon's company. He didn't play the fool like he had in the cafe, but was cheerful and relaxed. At the same time, he talked about all sorts of funny situations at work, reminisced about old friends and years of schooling. There was even room for a story about Simon's childhood in the village and his happy vacations. Listening to all this, Barbara did the most important thing, distracted herself from obsessive thoughts about her husband's love. Barbara realized it was time to go home. The time was approaching evening. She hailed a cab as they stood at the entrance to the mall. Thanks for the company on the shopping trip, Barbara smiled as the cab pulled up. Thank you for the pleasant walk. Maybe we could do it again sometime. Simon opened the cab door for her. This probably isn't the right thing to do, Barbara said. Simon gave her a quick peck on the cheek and said, Well, you're a big girl. It's time to get your priorities straight. Barbara drove home. Stunned, outraged, all the emotions of the last few days were mixed up in her. Resentment toward her husband, worry about their personal life, irritation, and in all of it, there were sparks of hints from Simon. It's wrong. It's not right that she's having coffee with Kate's best friend's husband, who's making ambiguous innuendos to her for the second time. Why? Well, of course she knows why. She knows she loves Kieran too. She knew that she valued Kate as a friend and a loved one. And she knew she wasn't ready to go along with what Simon was veiledly offering her. Plain and simple. But then why was she flattered by his attention? Wasn't it compensation for a grudge from Kieran? How long had it been since he'd spent nearly half of his day off with her? The more Barbara thought about it, the more the questions became, leading her down a dead end. Tomorrow I'll talk to Kieran straight, Barbara decided, and tell Kate the truth about her husband. That will be the proper prioritization. The next day, Barbara had few patience, so she got off early after work. On the way, a nervous Kieran called her and asked her to bring her work phone, which she had forgotten at home. On the way, she thought about the best words to say to her friend and her husband. She decided to start with the first one. She dialed Kate's number and proposed to meet in the evening. The makeup artist happily replied that she agreed and even asked if she should dress up in front of her. No, we'll just hang out, was the reply. As Barbara entered the apartment, she heard Kieran's work phone ringing. She picked it up near the mirror in the hallway and glanced at the screen absently. There were about 10 missed calls, Sami, some news reports, Greg, Barbara mumbled as she glanced at the call sheets on her smartphone. She was already getting into a cab when a text message sent around 1 o'clock in the morning caught her eye. Missed you, my affectionate boss. Looking forward to tomorrow, Barbara felt as if she had been doused with cold water. There it was. Here were her suspicions. Here, in her hands, on the screen of her husband's phone. Tears came to her eyes. Her nose crinkled and her throat was filled with rage and jealousy. Barbara caught her gaze in the rearview mirror and was stunned. She was looking at an angry and deceived woman, hungry for revenge and justice. All plans to talk to her husband were forgotten at that moment. The boss. Then Barbara whispered, clutching the phone so tightly that it nearly cracked. The cab driver involuntarily glanced at the passenger. He instinctively sensed that something was going on behind him. The only thing the girl managed to do before her jealousy finally drowned her was to write down the number from which the text message had come. Barbara burst into the agency's office with flaming cheeks. The staff said hello to her, but the girl didn't hear them. She yanked Kieran's office door open to the astonished stares, but it wouldn't budge. "Kieran Sergeyevich isn't here. He's at lunch," said a fellow practicing journalism student timidly. "What's going on here?" he asked, being the first to catch Barbara's furious glare. "We'll wait for him here," she said. Barbara stared angrily at the empty assistant's chair next to the office and plopped down in it. Tapping her fingers expectantly on the tabletop, she felt a mixture of fear and bewilderment from the entire office. Someone had apparently called Kieran on the sly, and he'd rushed in a couple minutes later. "Did you have a good meal, love?" Barbara said sarcastically, getting up from her chair and shoving the phone screen with the text message angrily up his nose. At the same time, she glared angrily at Stacy, who was frozen in the doorway behind the chief with a stack of papers. "Barbara, what's the concert?" Kieran questioned, trying to lead his wife into the office. "Come on, let's talk quietly." Barbara broke out of her husband's arms and expressively raised her hand with the phone, showing it to the whole office. "No, why? I want everyone to know what a wonderful man you are," she emphasized the word wonderful. "A decent boss and a faithful husband." Kieran clutched his head, ashamed of his wife. "And you," Barbara pointed her finger at Stacy, Kieran's assistant, "should be ashamed of yourself for messing around with another man's husband." "Barbara, stop it." Kieran grabbed his wife in an armful and dragged her forcefully into his office. Let me go, you traitor." Barbara lashed out, hitting her hand on the door. Angry, Kieran sat his wife in a chair and, looming over her, asked, "Here, even if there's such urgency, why this show-off? What are you trying to accomplish?" Barbara looked at him with eyes red with rage and tears. She poked her husband in the face again with the work phone with the message. "How do you explain this? Sleeping with your young assistant. It's all clear. The old wife is no longer honored. You've gone completely insane." Kieran rubbed the bridge of his nose and exhaled. Obviously, someone got the wrong number in the heat of correspondence. "I even know who that redhead you come home with in your hair." "God, you have nothing better to do than look for other people's hair on my shirts." Kieran rolled his eyes. "Find something more productive to do. And Stacy has a fiancé, for your information." "You call your Stacy's number, and we'll see if she's wrong," Barbara demanded with clenched fists. Everything inside her was churning with rage, responding with a new wave to every phrase of her husband, her back, cheeks, and forehead burning. Kieran picked up his work smartphone and pressed the speakerphone during a call. The electronic voice of the answering machine came through the receiver. It rang several times, but to no avail. "That doesn't prove anything," Barbara said. "Barbara, go home. Please stop embarrassing me in front of my subordinates," Kieran asked in a very firm, quiet voice, turning away to the window. The girl felt that her claims were being ignored, that it was as if everyone was laughing out loud at her without being embarrassed about it. Why? Why did it say the word boss? She threw back at Kieran, grabbing the doorknob. "I have no idea." "As if there weren't enough chiefs in Swan Town," Kieran replied without turning around. Barbara left her husband's office, and a dozen prying eyes stared at her. She walked briskly down the corridor without looking at anyone. On her way out of the building, she saw Stacy standing by the parking lot. She was being hugged and apparently comforted by some guy. Barbara froze for a moment, and then a wave came over her, burning her from the inside out. The tears she had been holding back for so long rushed from her eyes. It's okay, Kate said, counting the drops of valerian. "Men are like that, tricky, but you don't have to cry about it. Appreciate your dignity." She handed Barbara a glass of water and a sedative to a shuddering Barbara. Kate arrived as soon as she heard her friend's unintelligible voice on the phone, mixed with crying. "Kate, I've embarrassed him," she took the glass with shaking hands. "And him and myself. I'm anticipating the news on their website. Editor's ex-wife breaks into office. God, what a shame." Barbara was in tears again. She hadn't been able to calm down for about an hour. "Well," Kate said, "at least you'll be remembered. Why do you have to go there anyway?" "I'm such an idiot." Barbara leaned into her friend's shoulder. We're all a little bit stupid. Kate put her hands on her head. Why did you call me this afternoon? Barbara realized that she couldn't take another confrontation today. I just wanted to chat, she said. Maybe go shopping? Well, we're not going anywhere now. No amount of foundation can hide your puffy eyes. I'm an expert, Kate said, raising her finger to the ceiling, which made Barbara smile a little. What are you going to do about Kieran? I don't believe in random texting, she persisted. I don't know, maybe I'm really paranoid. Barbara slumped into the back of the couch and stared at the ceiling. If that's the case, you should apologize. I'd still fight it, Kate persisted. It was reckless of him to sleep with his almost secretary. It's like a joke situation. There's someone else here for sure. I'll talk to him if I can. Barbara exhaled. For some reason, she dialed the number she had copied from her husband's phone again, and once again it responded with the monotonous muttering of an electronic voice. Kieran came home late that evening, but Barbara waited for him. Her husband looked at her glumly and, without a word, left for the shower. Kieran. I'm sorry. Barbara waited for him in the room. The man walked past her, shook his head. I'll forgive you, Barbara. Except that my reputation is ruined by this tantrum today. There'll be whispers behind my back, and I've given Stacy the day off. I was wrong. Kieran. Barbara sighed sadly, sitting down on the floor. I'm so ashamed. I was so ashamed. Kieran sat down on the other side of the sofa. You've turned into some kind of paranoiac looking for hair in my things, sniffing around for some stupid mistake by a stranger, throwing tantrums. Damn her. It just seemed to me that our relationship had grown cold, Barbara murmured quietly. When it seems, my dear, it's customary to be baptized, said Kieran. Have you decided to play the jealous wife? The idea had failed. But Kate said. Barbara began. Would you and Kate be in the yellow ward together with such ideas? Her husband came at her again. She's listening to someone who can't see what's under her nose. But she advises you, and God forbid she herself has a husband who walks left and right. Suddenly Kieran cut himself off, half-phrased. It seemed that he had said something unnecessary, and now he was trying to take it back. Barbara's ears perked up. She squeezed the bridge of her nose with her fingers and covered her eyes, trying to calm down. And anyway, don't talk to Kate about any of that nonsense. She's a bad influence on you, he said at last. Kieran stood up and left the room, signaling that the conversation was over. Barbara was left sitting alone in the dark, confused and full of doubt. Kieran knows something about Simon, but he keeps quiet. Male solidarity. Why is he suddenly so set against Kate? She thought. Barbara paid no attention to her husband's apparent coldness and his unwillingness to address the problem and forgive her. A week passed. Life went on as usual. Angie, the head doctor of the clinic, informed Barbara that she and 2 other young dentists were going to a 3-day conference in another city. The girl was even a little relieved at this turn of events. It might help to take her mind off her worries, although outwardly Barbara had no reason to worry. Her husband was friendly to her. Kate still called and chatted non-stop about everything. The patients hadn't diminished, but the appearance of well-being hid Kieran's frightening coldness, the fading passion, the exhausting work that took up all her energy. Barbara could never find the strength to talk to her friend about her husband. She had no proof other than her own suspicions. I should get my family in order first, she thought. Kieran agreed that the trip would be good for his wife, and even bought her a train ticket. Go have a rest, listen to intelligent people, relax and get rid of all the nonsense from your head, he told Barbara, while she was packing a travel bag. The train swayed gently on the tracks. Barbara rarely rode trains, and every time she did, it was a surprise. Her colleagues were arguing animatedly. Nearby, glasses rattled under the clatter of the wheels. Maybe Kieran's right. I am overly suspicious. We've been together since we were 18, and there's never been any cause for jealousy, Barbara thought, looking out the window at the fir trees that flashed by at the station. And how many girls at the university were hanging around him? I didn't care much about it then. Yes, it was Kate's way of panicking herself and others. Whether it was the monotonous rocking that chased away the bad thoughts or the atmosphere of the trip, Barbara was in a pleasant mood. She laid her head down on the pillow that smelled of iron and fresh fabric. "I'll be back and we'll definitely go to Grandma's in Utah," Barbara decided and closed her eyes. Training in the company of the sun and sea really did the girl good. In the morning, she and her colleagues listened to seminars of experienced doctors and presentations of new materials, and in the afternoon they went to the beach to sunbathe and swim. The sea climate and fresh air seemed to erase the worries from her mind. Barbara thought about how she would return home, how she would tell Kieran about the trip, how then the two of them would go to the place where malachite was mined. "It's a shame Kate isn't with me," the girl thought, watching the waves. She said she hadn't been to the sea for a couple of years. Barbara really wanted to share the peacefulness with people close to her. After all, co-workers are only co-workers. On the third day, the organizers said that the last speaker would not be able to come due to illness, apologized to the participants, and announced the closing of the training. Barbara decided not to stay another day in the hotel with the others, but bought a ticket for the same day and went home. "That'll be a surprise for Kieran. I'll arrive early." And with a tan too, she smiled as she looked out the window at the sea. The train arrived at its destination early in the morning. On the trip, Barbara had a nice chat with a neighbor and her 9-year-old grandson. Granny treated the girl to fruit and enjoyed listening to her stories about her work, remembering her own youth. The morning city was just waking up. The air washed by the night rain was not as warm as at the sea, and even a little fresh. Outside the cab window were still sleepy alleys and early joggers in the alleys. The first rays of sunshine dispersed the mist, the remnants of which played in the puddles, and the drops glistened on the bushes and tree branches. The cab driver helped Barbara unload her bag, wished her a good day, and drove off after the new passengers. She thought about how she would now go up to the apartment, go in quietly, and get into bed with a sleeping Kieran. How nice that today was her husband's day off and they could sleep through lunch together, then make coffee and talk about their upcoming trip. Barbara quietly turned the key in the lock so as not to wake Kieran. Quietly, she entered the apartment and, barely seeing the familiar hallway, was taken aback. All the good mood she'd brought with her from the sea had gone down and shattered into tiny pieces. Her heart was pounding like the wheels of the train that had brought her back here. There were shoes lying in the hallway that she would recognize out of 100. They'd bought them together last year and picked up the last pair in town. The shoes had been Kate's. At the mirror, however, Barbara saw her keys and an equally all too familiar car key fob. For a moment, a naive, childish thought crept into her head: what if something had happened, and Kate had come to ask for help? But that thought was immediately smothered under the pressure of the obviousness of what was happening. From the bedroom, Barbara heard soft voices. It seemed to her that her heart was pounding so loudly that the neighbors could hear it. The girl crept quietly to the door and froze, listening to what was going on behind it. "I almost talked him into leaving," Stacy completely said, a familiar female voice. "The divorce will be finalized as soon as the official deal is done," Kieran's voice replied. "Same day," the woman confirmed. "And when are you going to file the papers?" There was a sigh. "I think." The idea of a fake affair had failed. Barbara entered the apartment before she could turn the key. There were shoes lying in the hallway that she would have recognized out of 100. They'd bought them with Kieran last year and picked up the last pair in town. The shoes were Kate's. By the mirror lay her keys and a familiar car fob. For a moment, a naive thought crept into my head that maybe something had happened and Kate had come to ask for help. But that thought vanished immediately under the weight of the obviousness of what was happening. Quiet voices came from the bedroom. Barbara crept to the door and froze, listening. "I almost talked him into leaving," Stacy completely said, a familiar female voice. "We'll get the divorce finalized as soon as the official deal is done," Kieran's voice replied. The same day, the woman confirmed. "And when are you going to file the documents?" There was a sigh. "I think." "The fake treason idea failed," Kieran said with annoyance. "It failed because someone left their work phone at home," a woman's voice interrupted reproachfully. "I've been working her as hard as I can. A little more, and she would have filed for divorce herself. And we would have gotten away with it. And now it is necessary either to speak in the forehead or something else to think up." "Head on," came the answer after a pause. "It's a pity." I don't like her as a woman, but as a human being I pity her. And to make a show is not pitiful. With a chuckle said the interlocutor. The lesser of two evils. My choice, the man's voice said with a chuckle. Barbara clamped her hands over her mouth, feeling the corners of her eyes moisten. A wave of cold rolled down her back. Her cheeks flared with heat, and her throat felt like it was being squeezed in the grip of an invisible hand. The realization came in pieces, each one more repulsive than the last, burning away all the good inside like acid. Kieran, you and I met back in college. Kate's voice was quiet, ingratiating. But you were too right then, and I was too stupid. But if it had worked, there wouldn't have been all these years, divorces, other husbands, and everything would be easier now. We'd be living abroad somewhere by now. If it works out, it will, Kieran confirmed. We'll manage the salon and the agency remotely. Barbara felt her tears wet her shirt, leaving a hot, wet trail on her chest. When we're gone, maybe they'll do something about the marriage thing. Kate laughed from behind the door. I've seen the way he looks at her, it's perfect. He likes dumplings and borscht and soap operas at night. She's never been as good as you. She loves her job and doesn't like herself very much, said Kieran. We live like neighbors. I'm tired of the homegirl who always has everything planned. I feel like an old man around her. I want something different. I know what you want, Kate said. Family. Freedom. There was a commotion. Barbara sat against the wall outside the door, shaking with shame, pity, disgust, resentment, and a sense of betrayal by the two people she thought closest to her after her mother. The cold hands of reality finally closed around her throat. She jumped up and flung herself out of the apartment. Out into the street, into the morning. Barbara ran and ran, fleeing from the shame and embarrassment she had lived in for so many years. She was disgusted with her own existence and wanted to forget, to erase her memory. To go back 10 years, to not reach out, to find others, to send the smug Kieran away. Every year that passed felt like it was whipping her in the back, leaving deep wounds and causing the pain to grow worse and worse. Tears covered her eyes, everything was cloudy and barely recognizable. She stopped to catch her breath and ran again. Passers-by heard her screams, but Barbara neither saw nor heard them. She wanted to hide from this vile feeling, from herself. Girl, look out. It was the last scrap of reality that imprinted itself on her memory before pain and darkness consumed her. The peaceful sounds of a squeak snapped Barbara out of oblivion. She thought irritably at first, what's that nasty squeak that sounds like the trills of an electronic alarm clock from the 90s? Her eyes opened with difficulty. Her body felt like absorbent cotton. My right leg felt like it was made of stone and wouldn't move. My entire right side responded with a painful tingling sensation when I tried to turn around on the bed. My head was buzzing. Good morning. You're finally awake. Barbara, the woman in the white coat, greeted her. Barbara looked around and only then realized that she was in a hospital bed. What happened to me? She looked at the leg in a cast sticking out from under the blanket. You were hit by a car, the doctor said, looking at the paperwork. I'm surprised you got away with a broken leg, a mild concussion, and moderate bruising. Others in such cases are put together in pieces. Were you born with your shirt on? The family will be happy to know you're on the mend. Not all the family. Barbara turned her back to the wall. Will someone come to call your relatives? The doctor asked. Tell my husband that I was hit by a car and died. I can't go back. I don't want to see him again, and I don't want to see her ever again. I beg you, Barbara said without turning around. The doctor shook her head. If they come, don't let them in my room, Barbara added. The hospital was dreary, but the walls with the Red Cross seemed to distract her from the painful thoughts of what had happened. The physical pain didn't seem to bother her as much as the tearing of her soul. The mother rushed to the hospital half an hour after the call. She was first upset, then cursing, then crying at her daughter's bedside. Barbara told her everything she had heard that morning. Lexi left her daughter's room, slipped the nurses boxes of candy, and threatened to complain to the head doctor, ordering her not to let anyone with names beginning with the letters M and K see her daughter. Barbara blocked the numbers of her husband and the lying friend. She asked her mother and a coworker friend to pick up her belongings from her husband's apartment when he was away. Doctors said rehabilitation would take about 3 weeks. The fracture would finally heal in 3 months. One day there was a knock on the room door. Barbara thought it was one of the staff, although they usually didn't bother to knock. "Come in," she shouted, not taking her eyes off the magazine her mother had brought. "Hello, Barb," came a familiar voice. Simon stood in the doorway with a bouquet of flowers, and when she saw Barbara's robe thrown over her shoulders, she had mixed feelings. Seeing her ex-girlfriend's husband reminded her of what had happened. On the other hand, it was as if he had nothing to do with it. "You don't know how hard it is for me to get here," the man complained, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "They're practically checking IDs to get to you." "That's my request," Barbara nodded. "Why are you hiding from someone?" Simon joked. "Maybe I am the girl confirmed." Simon stared at her in surprise. His eyes were filled with question and incomprehension. Barbara exhaled and decided to tell him. She remembered everything Kate at the Institute, her consumerist attitude toward men, and the hypocrisy of her friend. Simon listened with his mouth open. "I don't want you to fall victim to their game. Divorce soon and don't listen to any pleas. A salon? Don't you dare buy one. Kate is using you and has been using you," Barbara finished. "How do you know that?" Simon asked, stunned, not believing his ears. They talked about it for a long time. She asked him not to tell anyone where she was or what was wrong with her, and not to do anything stupid that would ruin his life. Toward the end, as Simon was leaving, he asked, "Barb, tell me, do I have a chance?" "Not now," she shook her head. "I want to be alone. Maybe in the future. Maybe." "I understand. Get well soon. And I'll come by, if you don't mind," Simon nodded. "Come," she blinked, showing her agreement. Time passed differently in the country than it did in the city. It's measured and quiet. The hustle and bustle are alien to those who are used to getting up to the crowing of the rooster. A light frost touched the rowan berries, which shone against the snow with bright lights. The sun disappeared behind the horizon. The fresh snow had not yet been trampled by anyone's feet and paws. "Granddaughter, there's a letter for you," Angie shouted as she came in, waving the envelopes. "Thank you," Barbara shouted from the kitchen. She was making a simple breakfast for herself and her grandmother. "It's been a long time since I've seen a letter," Angie said, sitting down on a stool. "You young people are all on your gadgets, and you've given up writing." She handed Barbara an envelope. She took a quick glance at the sender's name and decided to read it later. After she recovered, Barbara went straight to her grandmother's house in Swan Village. She could not stay in the city, where every street reminded her of the betrayal and shame she had experienced. The girl quit her job, took care of other minor matters. She made her mother her representative in the divorce proceedings, so she wouldn't have to face Kieran again. "Out of sight, out of mind," her mother said as she saw her off. "Go as you like, and come back as you like. Just call often," her mother said to Barbara before she left. It was quiet in Swan Village. There the pain began to subside and gradually recede. Time was doing its work, healing the wounded soul. Her mother didn't talk about Kieran and the divorce, only promised to tell her when it was over. The envelope had Simon's address and name on it. How he knew where to find her remained a mystery. Barbara ran her eyes cursorily over the lines. Simon had written about the divorce, about leaving Kate nearly destitute. That part of the letter she deliberately skipped. "Dear Barb, I realize I'm probably an extra person in your life, but since that night at the hospital you haven't left my mind. I've made a lot of mistakes and missed a lot of chances, but I don't want to let you go." The girl paused, listening to herself. Something faintly trembled in her after those words. "I'm willing to wait as long as you say. I hope for an answer. Simon." Barbara folded the letter, tucked it away in an envelope, and began to twirl it in her hands. If she had still had doubts at the hospital, she knew for sure now. Angie came into the room, thinking of what to say to him. She looked at her granddaughter's focused face. "I think old suitors aren't invited into a new life," Barbara smiled at her grandmother, tearing open the envelope. She tossed the scraps into the trash can and looked out the window. "Grandma, The neighbor's probably here to ask about Vince again. She's so restless, she's already got her hands full. The older woman nodded. They're all worried about Sami.